Welcome, wrestling fans, to the Pro Wrestle Machine. Whether you're tuning in from the Great American Bash or halfway around the world, we've got a jam-packed episode for you. Get ready to dive into wrestling's rich history, packed with insights, opinions, and a few surprises. And remember, you can skip to your favorite moments with our chapter markers. Let's jump right into it. July 10, 2000 Wrestling Observer Newsletter. WWF signs Brock Lesnar. Future of ECW, more. By Dave Meltzer. Wrestling Observer Newsletter. With the WWF television situation being straightened out, now all eyes are on the future of ECW, both as far as national television and the company's survival itself. ECW was officially cancelled, as expected by TNN, effective with the show airing on September 22. This date appears to preclude any chance of USA Network having ECW ready to go on the air the Monday after WWF leaves, which is believed to be the first week of September, although nobody has been able to confirm an official date, in an attempt to have a wrestling show ready to keep at least a small part of the huge audience that by habit tunes to USA in that time slot. At press time, ECW had not signed a deal for the new TV season. Reports are there has been communication between ECW and USA over the past week, but no deal has been finalized, nor has any decision been made by Barry Diller regarding whether USA would even want a wrestling show for the new season. Those who have been in negotiations with Fox indicate that while they have negotiated with a number of different people, what the station is looking for is a 1-hour late afternoon Monday through Friday show that would be provided to the network, largely aimed at kids and teenagers, which the ECW product would have to be heavily modified to fit. Those who have been in negotiation with Fox about wrestling say they are mainly interested in either doing something with WCW or doing something with Hulk Hogan, independently of WCW. ECW received an influx of new money in recent weeks, as they have made payroll both this past weekend and the previous payroll of 2 weeks earlier after missing payroll. The wrestlers and those working for the company are now one payroll cycle behind. Paul Heyman has denied reports elsewhere the influx of capital came from a group headed by Jay Hassman and former WCW executives such as David Crockett and Rob Garner, who have talked in the past about purchasing the company. ECW has failed to meet some of the criteria of the agreement, including ratings performance targets, according to the statement released on June 29 by TNN announcing the cancellation. We appreciate the efforts ECW and Paul Heyman have made to bring wrestling fans to TNN. There have been bitterness back and forth between ECW and TNN since the cancellation was announced. Although Heyman had explained to Brian Hughes of TNN that the ECW versus TNN feud was nothing more than a television angle a la the Vince McMahon versus Steve Austin angle, it appears that was an angle in itself, similar to Brian Pillman's famous angle where almost the only ones let in on the angle, Kevin Sullivan and Eric Bischoff, were actually the two people Pillman was designing the angle to work in the first place. Heyman painted the network as the villains, and he was allowed to blast them hard on television, including knocking their programming, including Roller Jam, which ECW was positioned originally to help build an audience for, under the guise it was a TV wrestling angle. Once he recognized the odds were strong the show wasn't going to be renewed because word got out regarding the Viacom/WWF negotiations. ECW had complained for months about the lack of promotion the show had received, which in hindsight appears to be because the station, in strong negotiations with the WWF, didn't want to promote a show they figured was a lame duck. While ECW never came close to the 1.9 to 2.0 season average that TNN was promising advertisers and predicting publicly before the season started that the show would do, roughly double what it ended up averaging, it was still the highest rated show on every Friday night but one for TNN this season. However, it is said that the contract only allows cancellation on the guise of poor ratings if the show were to average in 0.6 or below over the course of 1 month, a level ECW has never reached for even one episode, let alone averaged over the course of a month period. The WWF signing of Brock Lesnar, who just captured the NCAA heavyweight title at the University of Minnesota, brings up the long list of former NCAA wrestling champions that have gone on to pro wrestling. Lesnar becomes the third former NCAA heavyweight champion under contract to the WWF, the others being Kurt Angle and Sylvester Terkay, the latter of whom has a developmental deal and is wrestling in Ohio Valley as the Collector. However, he is the first NCAA heavyweight champion, or for that matter, champion in any weight class, to come right out of college into pro wrestling since Chris Taylor did so with far greater fanfare in 1973. Within the amateur wrestling community, he was the first top star since Steve Williams in the early 80s, who actually started as a pro wrestler during the summer while still attending and playing football at the University of Oklahoma. where it was believed throughout the amateur circles that he was tailor-made to someday wind up in pro wrestling. With offers coming also from WCW and New Japan, Lesnar was probably the most recruited athlete to come into pro wrestling since Ken Shamrock had offers from the same three companies as well as UFC when UFC failed to pick up the option on his contract in early 1997. Dennis Rodman was actually the subject of a bidding war to speak, where WWF wanted to use him at a WrestleMania to give a celebrity rub to Goldust, but WCW outbid and brought him in to give the rub to Hulk Hogan and the NWO, but that was for a one-shot appearance, although the money figures were large. Coming out of the 1996 Olympics, since Bruce Baumgartner had made it clear he wasn't interested in pro wrestling, the two wrestlers most recruited were Angle, who immediately turned down a lucrative WWF offer because at the time he wasn't interested in pro wrestling, which most in amateur wrestling look down upon because of the thought of the theatrics and the mentality of it being fixed and the belief it gives their very real and very tough sport a negative stigma with the general public, and Matt Ghaffari, the Greco-Roman super heavyweight silver medalist. Ghaffari had offers from both WWF and WCW, but after a WWF tryout and WCW look, chose to continue in amateur wrestling to attempt to make the 2000 Olympic team, a quest that he failed at on June 24 in Dallas. Mark Henry, the super heavyweight weightlifter, who didn't place in the Olympics, had already signed a 10-year contract with the WWF, and it was well known he was going into pro wrestling with a major push, which hasn't panned out, before the Olympics had taken place. As mentioned before, the list of former NCAA champions that have gone into pro wrestling is long. Not all have been successful, but even though the prevailing wisdom in pro wrestling is that most shooters don't make good pros, more have been than haven't. Of the 16 who have gone into pro wrestling, 5 were Hall of Fame caliber: Earl McCready, Leroy McGuirk, Vern Gagne, Danny Hodge and Jack Briscoe. 4 more were major stars, with Kurt Angle already establishing himself on that list after just 1 full year in, and 2 others were solid performers. Totally 16 of the 16 on the list is making it, and 1 other who was never a big star, but had a lengthy career. Only 4 can be considered as flops, ironically all but one of whom entered pro wrestling after 1973 when fewer great amateurs made the jump, combined with wrestling upping the ante when it comes to being gimmick-oriented. Angle this past year was actually the first NCAA champion to truly make it as a pro wrestler since Briscoe. Of course, prior to 1985, the credential alone often got you to at least respectable status in the industry if you showed any aptitude for it, and a lot of promoters, although the number dwindled as the old line promoters started to fade from the scene. Many of the old line promoters, such as Ray Gunkel, McGuirk, Bob Geigel, Bill Watts, Dory Funk Sr., Stu Hart and Gagne, were good amateurs themselves, or Eddie Graham, who had such a strong desire for his product to be taken seriously, loved to push as top stars people who had legitimate sports backgrounds. There have been notable failures, such as Evan Johnson, who never took to it and few remember the name, but the list of successes includes some of the all-time greats of pro wrestling. Many other major names including Gorilla Monsoon, Steve Williams, Dan Severn, Tim Wooden, Tim Mr. Wrestling 1 Woods, Gunkel and Gary Albright placed as high as second in the NCAA tournament during their collegiate days, as did former UFC tournament winner Kevin Jackson, who was the opponent in Frank Shamrock's UFC middleweight title win. Bob Backlund was billed in pro wrestling during his reign as WWF champion as having been an NCAA Division I champion. Backlund was Division II champion at North Dakota State in 1971 at 190 but didn't place in the Division I tournament. Brad Rheingans, who also went to North Dakota State, won the 1975 Division II tournament at 190 and placed 4th at the Division I level that year, losing the 3rd place match to another future pro wrestler, Laurent Soucy. In recent years, with the advent of UFC, because legitimate wrestling skill is probably the most valuable skill of all as a start, not as a complete package, but more successful top stars in UFC have had a strong amateur wrestling background than any other singular sport-specific background. Many UFC champions have come from a strong collegiate wrestling background, including the current heavyweight champions of the 2 major organizations, Pride, Mark Coleman, and UFC, Kevin Randleman. As complete a list as we can find of former NCAA champions dating back to the first NCAA tournament in 1928 and heavyweight champ Earl McCready, who was one of Canada's original pro wrestling legends, who tried pro wrestling, or MMA, is as follows. 1928, Earl McCready, heavyweight, Oklahoma A&M. 1929, Jack Van Beber, 165, Oklahoma A&M. 1929, Earl McCready, heavyweight, Oklahoma A&M. 1930, Jack Van Beber, 165, Oklahoma A&M. 1930, Earl McCready, heavyweight, Oklahoma A&M. 1931, Leroy McGurk, 155, Oklahoma A&M 1931, Jack Van Beber, 165, Oklahoma A&M 1934, Wayne Martin, 135, Oklahoma 1935, Wayne Martin, 145, Oklahoma 1935, Ralph Silverstein, 175, Illinois 1936, Wayne Martin, 134, Oklahoma 1941, Leonard Levy, heavyweight, Minnesota 1946, George Bolas, heavyweight, Ohio State 1947. Joe Scarpello 175, Iowa 1947, Dick Hutton, heavyweight, Oklahoma A&M 1948, Vern Gagne 191, Minnesota 1948, Dick Hutton, heavyweight, Oklahoma A&M 1949, Vern Gagne, heavyweight, Minnesota 1950. Joe Scarpello 175, Iowa 1950, Dick Hutton, heavyweight, Oklahoma A&M 1955, Dan Hodge 177, Oklahoma 1956, Dan Hodge 177, Oklahoma 1957, Dan Hodge 177. Oklahoma 1960, Dale Lewis, heavyweight, Oklahoma 1961, Dale Lewis, heavyweight, Oklahoma 1965, Jack Briscoe, 191, Oklahoma State. 1971, Greg Wojciechowski, heavyweight, Toledo 1972, Chris Taylor, heavyweight, Iowa State 1973, Chris Taylor, heavyweight, Iowa State 1976, Evan Johnson, 190, Minnesota 1981, Mark Schultz, 167, Oklahoma 1982, Mark Schultz, 177, Oklahoma 1983, Mark Schultz, 177, Oklahoma 1984, Kenny Monday, 150, Oklahoma State 1987, Boyce Alger 167, Iowa 1988, Mike Van Arsdale 167, Iowa State 1988, Boyce Alger 177, Iowa 1988, Mark Coleman 190, Ohio State 1990, Kurt Angle, heavyweight, Clarion 1992, Kevin Randleman 177, Ohio State 1992, Mark Kerr 190, Syracuse 1992, Kurt Angle, heavyweight, Clarion 1993, Kevin Randleman 177, Ohio State 1993, Sylvester Turkey, heavyweight, North Carolina State 2000, Brock Lesnar, heavyweight, Minnesota, the first ever NCAA heavyweight champion. Earl McCready from Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, was one of Canada's first superstar pro wrestlers. He headlined around the world for nearly 3 decades, and was particularly well known in England, where he was one of the first superstars in the country when wrestling hit television, and Western Canada, where is he remembered by old-timers alongside Stu Hart as the old-time wrestling legends in Western Canada. McCready still stands with the best collegiate record of perhaps any wrestler in history, going undefeated in 3 years and pinning all but 3 foes. Besides his 3 NCAA titles, he won 4 national freestyle titles, 1 in the US and 3 in Canada, a gold medal in the 1930 British Empire Games. His percentage of pins is the best of any collegiate wrestler in American history. As successful as McCready was, Jack Van Beber, his college teammate at Oklahoma A&M, now Oklahoma State, who also won 3 NCAA titles and captured the gold medal in the 1932 Olympics, was unsuccessful as a pro. He was also undefeated in college and only lost once during his entire adult life on the amateur mats. Little is known about his career as a pro wrestler, other than he tried it and lasted less than 1 year. But in a 1950 poll of the country's greatest amateur athletes of the first half of the century, Van Beber cracked the top 10. Leroy McGurk was the 3rd member of that dominant Oklahoma A&M wrestling team to go on to pro wrestling. McGurk was the dominant non-heavyweight wrestler in the world from early in his pro career until his very last match. McGurk's career in many ways paralleled the man who he made into an even bigger international pro star as a promoter years later, Danny Hodge. He first won the World Light Heavyweight title in 1934, and spent the next 3 years bouncing the title back and forth among the 3 other greats in the division of that era, Hugh Nichols, Danny McShane, and Wild Red Berry. He went up to junior heavyweight and on June 19, 1939 in Hollywood, Florida, defeated John Swensky to win the National Wrestling Association World Junior Heavyweight title. It was a belt he would never lose. As holder of that title, when the National Wrestling Alliance was formed in 1948, he was recognized as their World Junior Heavyweight Champion. McGurk was blinded in one eye during much of his career due to a bar fight, and lost the sight in his other eye during a 1950 auto accident which ended his active career. He got into promoting, running the territory that later became known as Mid-South Wrestling, which was the top junior heavyweight territory in the business during the 60s and 70s, built around Hodge, whose pro career was eerily similar, and helped start out both Bill Watts and Jim Ross as well. Wayne Martin, a three-time champion in the lighter weights during the mid-30s, wrestled professionally for many years, but was not a major star, perhaps due to his size. Ralph Silverstein became known as Ruffy Silverstein as a pro, and was a major star in the 40s and 50s. Although he was NCAA champion in 1935, he didn't go into pro wrestling until 1941. He was put over at the start, beating former huge draw Jim McMillan in his first pro match to win the old Illinois state title, and during one string, wrestled 6 years as a headliner in pro wrestling without losing one match, and was rated among the top 10 heavyweights in the world for most of his career. Leonard Levy became Butch Levy, a football and wrestling star in college who wrestled mainly in the Minnesota area after a short career in pro football. He was considered a possible world heavyweight champion during the late 50s, but never traveled enough to get his name over in enough parts of the country to where he was seriously considered. At one time in 1959 he held the Twin Cities version of the World Tag Team title, later to become the AWA World Tag Team titles, with both Gagne and Leo Nomellini as partners. George Bolas had a very successful pro career internationally as the 400-pound masked Zebra Kid, particularly in Europe where he was a huge attraction. Joe Scarpello, who captured 2 NCAA titles in 1947 and 1950, was a journeyman pro mainly working the AWA into the early 70s. Although he had a similar look as Gagne, who became one of the biggest stars ever, and was his contemporary, one make it big, and the other simply didn't make it. Jake Hutton, who came one double overtime loss to Gagne in 1949 away from being the first ever 4-time NCAA champion, was considered the best heavyweight wrestler of his era as an amateur. Hutton was pushed because of his credentials, but most remember him as being not particularly charismatic, nor was he a good draw as champion. Still, as NWA World Heavyweight Champion from November 14, 1957 when he won the title from Lou Thesz in Toronto, through January 9, 1959 when he lost it to Pat O'Connor in St. Louis, he was one of the biggest stars in the world during that period. Hutton's title reign was unique, in that the promoters didn't want him as champion, they wanted Buddy Rogers, who was considered the best worker of the era. Thesz had so much power in those days that when he quit the alliance to work more in Japan and overseas, he was able to pick Hutton to be his successor as champion. But Hutton didn't draw, and it was a low period for wrestling and the NWA title, and nearly resulted in the demise of the organization. Hutton wrestled a few more years after losing the title, but never overcame the stigma of being a failure as champion, before leaving pro wrestling and never looking back. Gagne, on the other hand, was one of the biggest stars in the history of the business, and probably can lay claim, with all due respect to Briscoe, to being the biggest pro star of any NCAA champion. Gagne had the misfortune of being a contemporary of Henry Wittenberg, the famous New York police officer who was in his prime and had a 350-match winning streak when it came to the Olympics, as Wittenberg destroyed everyone in sight in 1948 to win the gold after having a more difficult time with Gagne in the trials. Both a college wrestling and football star at the University of Minnesota and a strong NFL prospect, Gagne chose pro wrestling after being lowballed on an NFL contract offer, and it was no doubt in hindsight the right choice. Gagne hit it big from the start of his career because Minneapolis was a strong wrestling city and he became the local mad idol, just as wrestling hit it big on network television. Gagne was one of the first athletes ever to earn $100,000 per year in the early 50s. Reputedly the only ones were wrestlers Argentina Rocca, Lou Thesz and Gagne, as well as baseball star Joe DiMaggio, making a national name with a nearly 3-year run as the NWA United States heavyweight champion out of Chicago. At the time it was probably the second biggest title in the country behind the world heavyweight title that Lou Thesz controlled. Gagne held the title from 1953 to 56, the first 2 years being the top star of the Chicago wrestling show that aired in prime time on network television, and was one of Thesz's prime adversaries during that period. When Gagne finally lost the title on television to Wilbur Snyder, it what was considered one of the classic matches of the era and talked about in Chicago literally for nearly 2 decades, and catapulted Snyder in one match into major stardom that made his career as well. He bought into the Minneapolis promotion and broke off from the NWA when it wouldn't make him world champion, created his own AWA, and being its perennial champion during much of the 60s and 70s while also being one of the country's leading promoters and expanding his territory throughout the Midwest. Gagne was not well liked by the end, as he always wanted to look like a stud in the ring even when he was into his mid-50s, and much like Hulk Hogan, never really put anyone over clean as he got older. At the age of 55 in 1981, he finally retired, still holding the AWA World Heavyweight title. His promotion, which was considered one of the best territories to work because the money was good and the schedule was easy by the standards of the time, started falling in 1984 when Vince McMahon started hiring many of his wrestlers, announcers and front office. Gagne had a few decent years, and came out of retirement numerous times, going until he was injured fairly seriously, doing a comeback at the age of 60, and the promotion limped along until closing in 1991. Like Gagne, Danny Hodge was a legend in both pro and amateur wrestling. Hodge's pin percentage in college better than anyone besides McCready in history, also not only never lost in college, but was never even taken down, and only lost one match, a controversial gold medal match in the 1956 Olympics, over his last 5 years as an amateur. He went into boxing after doing everything possible in amateur wrestling, and in less than 1 year of putting gloves on for the first time, won the National Golden Gloves Championship. He first turned pro in boxing, which by the late 50s was doing a lot better than wrestling as an industry, and was rushed into a world light heavyweight title fight, which he lost. When he realized he was making no money in boxing, McGurk, in 1960, talked the local sports legend into pro wrestling. McGurk, who controlled the NWA Junior Heavyweight title, which was basically an undisputed world title that Hodge defended all over the world, but was based out of Oklahoma, for his entire career. McGurk rushed the title onto Hodge during his rookie year, on July 22, 1960, when he beat Angelo Savoldi in Oklahoma City in a match that had a story of its own. Hodge's father, unaware wrestling was a work, got so hot at Savoldi, who was healing on Hodge, that he attacked him, which wasn't part of the plan. Hodge lost it for short periods of time on several occasions, but basically dominated it through the end of 1973, when Bill Watts, as booker, brought him into the Florida territory and he left the belt with McGurk, after dropping it to Ken Mantell. He also held a Japanese version of the World Heavyweight title during that period, beating Thez. Except when Watts was in the area, Hodge was the area's biggest draw virtually his entire career, although he was not a major draw outside his home territory, but because of his genuine ability, he was also promoted highly on tours of Japan. When Hodge returned home, on March 2, 1976, he captured the title for a final time from his biggest career rival, Hiro Matsuda. Less than 2 weeks later, Hodge broke his neck in an auto accident, which largely ended his pro career. He did do a few comebacks as late as 1984. Both Hodge and Gagne were named in the top 50 athletes of the 20th century in their respective native states, Oklahoma and Minnesota, in the Sports Illustrated Millennium Special. Dale Lewis, who went to Oklahoma after Hodge, although the two were teammates on the 1956 Olympic team, had a solid career as a pro wrestler for about 16 years. Because of his background, which included 2 NCAA titles and Greco-Roman heavyweight on 2 Olympic teams, beating Gorilla Monsoon out for the heavyweight slot in 1960, a 1959 gold medal in the Pan American Games and 4th in the 1961 World Freestyle Championships, Lewis, after the Freestyle Worlds, went right into pro wrestling as a main eventer, and just a few months into his career was half of the AWA Tag Team Champions. Lewis was a good worker but not terribly charismatic. He did well in territories where the promoters liked to push shooters, such as Florida, where he had a major feud with Jack Briscoe in the AWA, but didn't do as well in other areas, finishing his career in the late 70s, including a stint in California as Professor Dale Lewis, and residing in Oregon until recently passing away. Briscoe was the prototype babyface star of the early 70s and arguably, for a short period, the biggest star in the entire business. He's remembered with reverence by virtually all his contemporaries as high on any list of all-time greats. Briscoe turned pro after the 1966 college wrestling season, wrestling for McGurk in Oklahoma, and quickly was taken under the wing of Eddie Graham, the promoter in Florida, who decided to go all the way with him as the top star in the company and was probably more carefully built up to be a world heavyweight champion than any wrestler of his era. Graham pushed Briscoe as his top star after he slowed his own active career down, and turned Briscoe versus Dory Funk Jr., the NWA champion from 1969 to 1973, into the consistently biggest match throughout much of the world. For years, the Jack Briscoe versus Dory Funk Jr. program, with Briscoe chasing the NWA World Heavyweight title, was the top-drawing program not only in Florida, but in virtually every territory where it was brought into, based on the legend of their 60 and 90-minute draws. Before the days of cable and national TV, Briscoe's star power, largely from wrestling magazines, was such that his debuts in new territories brought huge increases in the gate. He was scheduled to win the NWA title on March 2, 1973 in Houston from Funk after they had spent more than 2 years with a national chase program. Funk Jr. suffered an alleged shoulder injury days before the title was to switch, and it wound up with Briscoe's inauguration as the biggest star of the industry delayed until July 20, 1973, when he beat Harley Race for his first NWA World title. With the exception of a one-week drop in Japan to Giant Baba, which was Baba's first NWA title reign, Briscoe remained as champion through December 10, 1975, when he dropped it to Terry Funk in Miami Beach. He remained a headliner worldwide and a top contender for the NWA title with singles matches in St. Louis, where he groomed the next generation of headliners like Bruiser Brody, Ric Flair, Ted DiBiase, and Bob Backlund, and in Japan with famous matches with Tatsumi Fujinami, Antonio Inoki, and Jumbo Tsuruta, as well as holding numerous tag team titles with younger brother Jerry. But in the grand course of wrestling, his biggest lasting monument wasn't a great match, or even a great title reign, or even the brief period where he was the biggest star in the business, but a business decision in 1984. Jack and Jerry were partial owners of the Georgia territory by the early 80s, which, through Ted Turner's Superstation, had the highest rated and most watched wrestling show in the country. The Briscoes sold their stock, as well as convinced enough other shareholders in the company to follow suit, to give Vince McMahon, who had just started going national and competing with all the small regional promoters, the majority ownership of the company. Thus, for a one-year period from most of 1984 through early 1985, the two most watched pro wrestling TV shows in the country, 2 hours on Saturday night and 1 hour on Sunday, were controlled by the WWF, along with the USA Network, and a great syndication deal. This gave McMahon the foundation to get the jump on Jim Crockett in the wrestling war. Even though Crockett got in the game nationally in 1985 when he bought the time slot from McMahon, after Ted Turner had wanted McMahon off because of numerous complaints from Southern fans about the product and not providing a studio show from Atlanta, virtually all the mainstream media publicity was on the way down and McMahon got it all, and Crockett never could make up the lost ground. The selling of the Georgia stock right in the middle of a hot wrestling war came when the Briscoes were NWA Tag Team Champions, and they dropped the belts and went to the WWF. They were being groomed for a tag title run there when Jack, who grew tired of the road and the changes the business in the ring was undergoing, simply went home one day with no notice, and he never came back. The next run of NCAA champs hardly had that level of success. Greg Wojciechowski had the misfortune of being a contemporary of the legendary Chris Taylor, where he probably would have set records for national titles. In all, he won 8 AAU Freestyle National Championships, and had bad luck when it came to the Olympics. In 1972, he couldn't beat Taylor to make the Olympic team. In 1976, he was injured. In 1980, he made the team but the U.S. boycotted, so in his late 30s, he went into pro wrestling. He never made it past the local level in Ohio and Indiana, although he did at one point hold the WWA title for Dick the Bruiser and feuded with a rookie former collegiate star named Scott Reich-Steiner, long after it meant nothing, under the name The Great Wojo. The 420-pound Taylor, who won a bronze medal in the 1972 Olympics, was the first American heavyweight to earn an Olympic medal in 40 years, which made he and Dan Gable bigger names mainstream than perhaps any pro wrestlers of that period. After winning the NCAAs again in 1973, he signed a 4-year $100,000 per year, still astronomical money for pro wrestling in that era, contract with Gagne, which garnered a ton of mainstream media attention. His first pro match in Omaha was covered by all the national media outlets. Some of his early matches were against a crew-cutted dark-haired rookie by the name of Ric Flair. ABC TV aired its first pro wrestling match since the 50s when Wide World of Sports covered Taylor's biggest match of the early part of his career, against Mad Dog Vachon in Chicago, and it wasn't good. But as big as Taylor's name was before pro wrestling, he was a flop as a pro, both as a drawing card and in the ring. He went from territory to territory as promoters figured his mainstream name would sell tickets, but nobody was able to make it work, and faded out. His career was short-lived. He drifted away from pro wrestling, got ill from various complications due to his weight, which by then had exceeded 500 pounds, and died in 1979 at the age of 29. Johnson's career was so short few even remember it. After winning the NCAA title at the University of Minnesota, he continued his amateur career, eyeing the 1980 Olympics. After not making the team, he and two other hopefuls, Laurent Soucy and Brad Rheingans, who did make the team, were signed by Gagne. None had the charisma, although Rheingans was successful with New Japan and in training wrestlers. Johnson only lasted a few months in the AWA before fading out, and if anyone remembers him, it was only due to a confrontation he had with Bobby Heenan, at the time the heel manager in the territory and arguably the best in the business. The two were arguing over something, and Heenan responded, realizing in a fight he was out of his league. "What are you going to do, Evan? Kick my ass?" Johnson responded, "Okay, where do we get the mats?" After Johnson, Susi and Reingens failed to make it big, the line in wrestling was that good amateurs usually didn't make good pros, while as pro wrestling became more gimmick-oriented, particularly in the mid-80s, it was even more frowned upon by those in amateur wrestling than ever before. People like Steve Williams, Gary Albright and Darrell Peterson, who wrestled under such names as Max Payne and Man Mountain Rock, all top college heavyweights, and Dwayne and Dennis Kozlowski, who went to the Olympics and briefly wrestled shoot style in Japan, while Dan Severn and Craig Pittman were both world-rated amateurs, but none captured an NCAA title while in college. After Johnson, it wasn't until the past 2 years, when Angle, Turkey and Lesnar signed, that an NCAA champion wrestler even attempted pro wrestling. However, numerous NCAA champs have gone into the MMA world. Mark Schultz, with 3 NCAA titles and a 1984 Olympic gold medal, beat Gary Goodridge in his only UFC match, retiring after an ultimatum from Brigham Young University, where he coached, about losing his job if he continued participation. Kenny Monday, 1984 NCAA champ and 1988 Olympic gold medalist, scored a very impressive win over John Lewis on an EFC pay-per-view, before tapping out in less than 1 minute in a submissions-only match to Matt Hume and retiring. Hoyce Alger, 2-time NCAA champion, only had moderate success, winning some extreme challenge matches but losing to Eugene Jackson by knockout and Enson Inoue by quick submission in UFC competition. Mike Van Arsdale looked sensational in his early MMA matches, including a UFC match, but stopped fighting after a brutal knockout loss to Wanderlei Silva in Brazil. Mark Coleman had an up-and-down career in fighting, after making the 1992 Olympic team but losing in a loaded 1996 trials that included Angle, Mark Kerr, and Dan Chade. He breezed through early UFC competition, appearing to be unbeatable, capturing the heavyweight title from Severn, and then, lacking stamina, was upset by kickboxing champ Maurice Smith in one of the most famous matches in UFC history. Coleman blew out his knee, and lost his next 2 matches before coming back and winning the toughest tournament in MMA history on May 1st at the Tokyo Dome and being the consensus #1 heavyweight in the world. Angle, a 2-time winner and the only U.S. Olympic gold medal winning wrestler ever to go into pro wrestling since Pete Maringer and Jack Van Beber in 1932, was a reluctant wrestler but may end up in the same class as Gagne, Hodge and Briscoe as far as being a major success, and with the national television publicity, is likely more known nationwide than any ex-NCAA champ that went into the pros since Gagne entered early 50s. After spurning a big offer after the 1996 games, Angle went into sportscasting in Pittsburgh. When that didn't pan out, he sought out the WWF, which, due to it being 2 years after the Olympics and the name value of that win having dissipated greatly, weren't nearly as high on signing him. But he did so well in a tryout and picked things up so fast that he, barring injury, is almost a sure bet to be one of the biggest stars in the industry over the next 5 years. Randleman, another 2-time NCAA champion, suffered early MMA losses and probably the most controversial decision in UFC history in losing to Bas Rutten, but has rebounded to capture the UFC heavyweight title, which he currently possesses. Kerr was seemingly in line to win that same title, but after a contract dispute with Semaphore Entertainment Group that ended up in court with him winning, he has fought exclusively in Japan, and was the #1 ranked heavyweight in the world for some time, before his recent loss to pro wrestler Kazuyuki Fujita, himself a former Japanese national champion in amateur wrestling. The final 2 names on the list are the 2 big current questions. Turkey, who lost to Angle in the 1992 finals before winning the next year, is in Ohio Valley Wrestling. Clearly he has the size and the look to make it, with a strong physical resemblance to Frank Goodish, Bruiser Brody, at the same age. But at this point he is yet to impress inside the ring. Lesnar also has the right look and clearly has the physical skills, but whether he can put that together in the ring, or project his personality, is the question that will make or break him. The E! Channel on July 2nd ran a 1-hour bio of Jesse Ventura, which heavily featured his pro wrestling career. Ventura himself came off tremendously on the show, which brushed over much, but not all, of the negative of his current reign as governor to focus on the positive in the upset win in the election. But the show featured wrestling almost as much as the politics, with interviews with Vince McMahon, Billy Graham, Greg Gagne, and Jimmy Snuka. What I liked about this show was they, almost gave Adrian Adonis his fair due in Ventura's pro wrestling success, a subject that for whatever reason in most bios of Ventura, including his own best-selling book I Ain't Got Time to Bleed, got ignored. Ventura himself talked about being in school and being a jock, doing only enough academically to get by, and that his big excitement was when his copy of Wrestling Review, a newsstand magazine that was big in the 60s and 70s, came in the mail. He admitted his academics kept him from accepting a college swimming scholarship, which led to his enlisting in the Navy. It didn't talk much about how he got into pro wrestling, only that he was working in Oregon for 2 years, mainly feuding with Snuka, who, along with Dutch Savage, would have been his main rival, and who I'm just imagining how difficult it must have been to get a good sound bite out of, and then came home to Minneapolis to open his gym since he was having a hard time supporting a family on what he earned in wrestling. They talked about his meeting Verne Gagne, who wanted him to be a new version of superstar Graham, Ventura's wrestling idol who he patterned himself after, who was Gagne's top heel draw several years earlier when Ventura was a regular at the matches at the old Minneapolis Auditorium. They brought up the longtime pairing of Greg Gagne and Jim Brunzell versus Adonis and Ventura over the AWA tag titles, and Gagne commenting that Ventura wasn't a good wrestler, with Adonis carrying the matches in the ring, but that he was one of the best talkers in the business. They showed a lot of clips of Ventura's classic AWA interviews with Gene Okerlund. The story indicated he suffered the illness prior to a match with Hulk Hogan, true, which ended his career as a full-timer, but he continued to wrestle for another year or so, even after starting as an announcer, and led to him becoming an announcer. Ventura still claimed to have been the first heel announcer in wrestling, which isn't true. The role had been used going way back, as I can recall Ripper Collins doing the role in California in the early 70s, and on a nationally televised basis. The one who popularized the role was Roddy Piper on TBS in 1981. They claimed Ventura had problems with McMahon over wanting to start a union, and alluded that it ended their relationship. Actually, that incident was in 1986, right before WrestleMania 2, and historically has been built up into something far bigger than it actually was at the time. Ventura, after McMahon found out about his plan and nipped it before it ever gained any momentum, continued to work for McMahon through 1990, when he was fired over a dispute regarding a video game deal Ventura took and refused to back down when McMahon told him he had to give it up. It wasn't the first time the two problems, because Ventura didn't like being controlled and McMahon liked controlling all his talent. McMahon, on the air, claimed that Hulk Hogan had told him that Ventura wanted a union started, and Ventura was shocked when McMahon knew about it. Ventura, after getting the answer to his question while he was involved in a winning lawsuit against McMahon not covered in the story, which was actually a pretty big deal, has unmercifully ripped Hogan every chance he's gotten over the past several years. Hogan, on Larry King, claimed the whole story was made up and he never told McMahon about it. They brought up Ventura doing the refereeing at last year's SummerSlam, and Ventura acted there was nothing that said a governor on his off time can't have fun. The fact he was making a huge amount of money for one night, and that it was the value of the office of the governor of Minnesota, and not of Jesse Ventura without the office, which is what made it such a big deal, was never examined. It mentioned he was heavily criticized for it, including for the language he himself used while doing the show. McMahon noted that he knew Ventura would be criticized, but that he thought all that criticism was only good for his, Vince's, not Jesse's, business. There was no downside for McMahon, only Ventura on that one. The show actually ended with Ventura saying after leaving office, he wants a match against McMahon, and McMahon responded favorably to the idea. Due to the holiday weekend, none of the ratings except for Thunder and SmackDown are available at press time. The /A/EMLL show was preempted for soccer on June 27. SmackDown on June 29 drew a 4.59 rating and 8.2 share, showing basic consistent growth throughout the show and peaking with a 5.66 rating for the Jericho and Dudley's vs. DX main event. Thunder on June 28 drew the second straight 2.45 rating and 4.1 share. Japanese television rundown. June 10, New Japan. 1. Kanemoto beat Makabe in 10:37. The last 4 minutes aired of this Super Juniors tournament match. Kanemoto did a scary-looking reverse brainbuster on Makabe. It's similar to Bob Holly's Wadata maneuver of dropping the guy more vertical. What aired was really good. Makabe has a ton of potential and Kanemoto is as good as they come. 2. Kashin beat Minoru Fujita in 5:56 with an armbar coming out of nowhere. Fujita looked good, but there was no build to the finish. 2 stars. 3. Samurai pinned Wagner Jr. with a swinging reverse DDT off the top rope in 13:51. 2 stars. 4. Sasaki and Iizuka beat Goto and Ohara when Sasaki pinned Goto. Only the finish aired. 5. Chono and Norton and Tenzan and Kojima beat Johnston and Yoshi and Nagata and Nakanishi when Kojima pinned Yoshi after a lariat. Again, only the finish aired. 6. Sasaki pinned Nakanishi in 2014 to retain the IWGP Heavyweight title. Entire match aired. Very slow early. There was a cool spot where Nakanishi crossed up Sasaki's facebuster spot and gave him a spear. They traded no-selling lariats to the point of stupidity. A million lariats and both just stood there and made the tough guy faces before Sasaki finally went down to one knee. It picked up in the second half with mainly power moves and near falls. After escaping from the power strangle, Nakanishi came back with 5 spears and 2 lariats but only got a 2. Sasaki then caught him in a front guillotine and had him just about out. Sasaki let him go, then gave him a lariat, but Nakanishi kicked out. He then got the pin after the Northern Lights bomb. 2 1/4. June 14th, All Japan. This was largely built around the press conference clippings from both Misawa and Kawada's press conferences talking about the split. This was put together so well that if this happened in the US, I'd say it would have to be an angle, except in the US they could never hold the angle story together so well. 1. Toshiaki Kawada and Akira Taue won the double tag team title for the final time, beating Yoshihiro Takayama and Takao Omori in the tournament final in 16:55. The match was edited down to 7 minutes. Kawada was fantastic. Taue and Takayama were horrible together and Omori was generally fine. Taue had his shoulder heavily taped, so no fear mainly worked on it during the match. Kawada's comebacks were tremendous. Crowd got into the match, particularly since Kawada and Omori worked most of the way down the stretch, and went nuts for the finish, which was Kawada choking Omori out and then pinning him. Hard to rate because of how it was edited, and the nature, since much was great but a lot was really bad. 2. Jun Akiyama and Monokia Mossman beat Kenta Kobashi and Kentaro Shiga in 17-14. This was also heavily edited. The match was very good and told a story. Basically, Kobashi sold nothing and played Superman. Shiga pretty well did nothing but sell. Kobashi played the big brother and kept ordering him back in. Akiyama and Mossman did everything to Kobashi and he no-sold it, including repeated kicks to his bad knee. Finally, Akiyama kept kicking his knee and gave him 3 exploders, and he sold and rolled out of the ring. In the ring, Akiyama gave Shiga a cradle tombstone piledriver for the pin. Great match. The only negative was that when Mossman was in with Shiga, no matter what they did, and they were good, the crowd was dead. 3 1/2. June 21st, All Japan. The final episode of the show after 27 years opened with a 10-bell salute to Jumbo Tsuruta, with his wife and 2 children at ringside and all the wrestlers circling the ring with the fans chanting his name. 1. Kawada and Taue beat Ace and Barton in 14:35 in the first round of the tag title tournament. This was the typical funky Ace match with a good story and some great and bad work. Taue first choke slammed Ace off the apron. Ace and Barton came back with double impact, Road Warrior's Doomsday Device, on Taue, and he rolled out of the ring selling a shoulder and arm injury. They taped him up at ringside while Kawada went it alone. Taue came back and worked with one arm as they pushed the idea that Taue was Tsuruta's last regular tag team partner. The funniest part of the match was Ace going up to moonsault Kawada. I guess the idea was to hit for a near fall, since Kawada never moved, but Ace totally missed Kawada. People were laughing at that. The build to the finish was great, including Kawada using an Ace Crusher on Ace. Kawada was amazing down the stretch with his power bombs and high kicks, winning with an Enzui-Jiri on Ace. 3 1/2. 2. Takayama and Omori beat Misawa and Yoshinari Ogawa in 16:05 when Omori pinned Ogawa after a lariat. This bout was edited. They didn't get the heat the previous match got, but the work was better, except for Takayama, of course. 2 3/4. June 24th, New Japan. The show opened with a 10-count ceremony for Jumbo Tsuruta from the June 2nd Budokan Hall show. 1. Atani beat Minoru Fujita in 9:46 after the Spider Bomb, pinning Liger Bomb. Fujita used Atani's regular springboard drop kick to the back and dragon suplex combination on him for a strong near fall. Atani came back with his own dragon suplex and some killer power bombs. 3 3/4. 2. They showed the finish of Katsumi Yujuta beating Kid Romeo. It seemed okay. 3. Grant Hamada beat Kanemoto in 13 minutes with an armbar. Only the last few minutes aired. There was no build to the finish, so it seemed this one never got going. 4. Fujinami beat Osamu Nishimura in 11:29 with the abdominal stretch submission. As one could tell by the finish, this was 70s style, with Fujinami relying on moves like the Billy Robinson backbreaker that aren't even part of today's wrestling. Nishimura, in his first match back since being out for more than a year with testicular cancer, got a good reaction coming out. Crowd accepted the match as decent, but no great heat. Technically sound but kind of boring. 5. Chono beat Yoshi in 13:58 with 3 Yakuza kicks and an STF. The second half aired. It was fair. Major run-in after the match was over. 1 1/4. 6. Iizuka beat Nagata in 16:55 with a choke sleeper. Really good match between two of the best technical wrestlers in the company. 3 1/2. 7. Chono and Kojima and Tenzan beat Liger and Sasaki and Nishimura in 14:11. The last 5 minutes aired. Fast-paced, very good match with the crowd really into it. Nishimura got all kinds of near falls with suplexes and fans were into him. He was stopped by a double-team diamond cutter by Tenzan and Kojima, the move WWF announcers call a 3D but isn't, and then Kojima pinned him after a lariat. Kojima suffered a bloody nose. 3 1/4. Mexico. Gong magazine ran a photo spread of the Padiramo show, the combined AAA EMLL show on June 17. There were a lot of people at the show, but nowhere close to 40,000. If the place really holds 58,000, I'd estimate the real number at 20,000 to 25,000 as the entire upper deck was empty and the bottom deck was 2/3 full. Rey Bucanero and Ultimo Guerrero won the second half of the CMLL Tag Team Tournament on June 30 at Arena Mexico and meet the winners of the June 23 tournament, Emilio Charles Jr. and Mr. Niebla, for the titles stripped from Negro Casas and El Hijo del Santo on July 7. The main event on the show was the same program they've been doing for months with Pero Aguayo and Rayo de Jalisco Jr. and Mr. Niebla over Dr. Wagner Jr. and Pierroth Jr. and Apollo Dantes via DQ with Mascara Ano 2000 interfering and Villano Tercero making the save. AAA has introduced a new babyface Cibernetico to feud with the original. On June 25 in Morelia, they were advertising a mystery partner for Connect and Latin Lover in the main event against Cibernetico and Abismo Negro and Electroshock, and a new wrestler showed up under a Cibernetico mask. July 7 in Tijuana has Teen Yablas and Teen Yablas Jr. and Raya Jr. vs. Dantes NCN Caras and Mascara Ano 2000 on top plus La Parca, Nicho and Rey Mysterio are booked. AAA ran a show in Tijuana on June 30 with Connect and Dos Caras and Pero Aguayo Jr. winning the main event over AAA Psicosis and the returning Jerry Estrada and Cibernetico. During the match the fans started chanting Nicho, Nicho at the second Psicosis who works for the rival promotion, since the original Psicosis is now known as Nicho. Alan Stone and Super Colo and Motocross, who are all brothers, won the Distrito Federal Trios titles from Official and Guardian and Vigilante on June 22 in Naucalpan. Super Crazy returned to action in Naucalpan this past week. Mario Prado Jr. announced his retirement after a 15-year career. He recently lost a hair versus hair match to Ricky Marvin and was better known in recent years as El Fierro. Expect Silver King and Dandy to return to EMLL along with the former AAA mini-stars of the early 90s, Mascara de Sagrada, Taganchito, Piratito Morgan, and Fuercita Guerrera. All Japan. Genichiro Tenryu returned after a 10-year absence to the All Japan rings in a big surprise on the July 2 show at Korakuen Hall. They also announced that Tenryu would debut in the main event of the July 23 Budokan Hall show would be Tenryu and Toshiaki Kawada, who were an awesome tag team in the late 80s when they teamed against Stan Hansen and Manukia Mossman. He's also scheduled to work the entire August tour, whatever that turns out to be. Tenryu was already in Tokyo for his match later that night against Shinobu Kondori on the LLPW show. During the show Motoko Baba got on the mic between matches and announced the return of Tenryu, who shook her hand and Kawada's hand. Tenryu made his pro wrestling career after leaving sumo, where he was a big-name star, with All Japan and was along with Jumbo Tsuruta, its biggest native star of the decade and possibly the hottest wrestler in the country at the time he jumped. He got a huge, by the standards of the time, $800,000 per year over 5 years, which was an unheard of guarantee in wrestling 10 years ago, offered to head up a new promotion funded by a leading optical company called Super World Sports. This was one of those big money flops run by a billionaire who knew nothing about wrestling other than it was a booming business at the time, which didn't lose as much money as WCW, but didn't last as long either. It got a huge pop from most fans who chanted Revolution, which was what Tenryu's group, where Kawada was his number 2 man, was called back in the late 80s. Some fans were also really mad because bringing Tenryu back, due to the nature he left the company, not only leaving himself, but took numerous wrestlers with him, and the fact until his death, Shohei Baba never forgave him, is believed something Baba under no circumstances would have done, Although Baba did allow Bruiser Brody and Abdullah the Butcher back after they had jumped to New Japan, but Baba had different standards for foreigners since he actually started virtually all of his native wrestlers and some were almost like his own children. Tenryu and Motoko Baba became big-time babyfaces with the move. They may do a Tenryu vs Kawada match to determine the vacant Triple Crown in late October. Masafuchi met with Katsuji Nagashima of New Japan about doing an interpromotional angle, but the two sides couldn't work anything out. Basically, New Japan assumed that All Japan would be more desperate, but Fuchi wanted things booked on an equal basis and New Japan felt All Japan didn't have the talent depth to do so. The fact New Japan didn't send Riki Choshu or Tatsumi Fujinami for the meeting and All Japan didn't send Kawada also says something. At this point, the feeling in New Japan is that if All Japan closes up, at that point they'll get Kawada anyway. There is still the stigma of Motoko Baba working with New Japan because Baba truly hated Antonio Inoki for all those years and Motoko lived with that basically her entire adult life, plus Baba himself never trusted Choshu since he jumped to All Japan, but then 2 years later walked out on Baba. Kawada announced he was going to change the in-ring style to less near-fall drama to a harder and more realistic style. On the first show of the tour, which drew a sellout 2,000 for the debut of wrestling at the new Differ Ariake building, Kawada pinned Fuchi in 22:48 of the main event of a 5-match card. In that match, showing the new style, Kawada during the match threw 75 hard kicks in one match to Fuchi's face, body and leg. The crowd was largely quiet for the show, which was largely considered a so-so show in a great new facility. The July 2nd show at Korakuen Hall was considered a so-so show as far as match quality, but people thought it was a very good card because Tenryu returning was considered historic. That main event was Kawada and Mossman beating George Hines and Mike Barton when Kawada pinned Hines with an Enzuigiri. Hines was knocked out for a while after the match in the ring and couldn't even get up to shake Kawada and Mossman's hand after the match. It was legit since he was sent back to the United States for treatment after the match and left the tour. He is scheduled to return. Pride President Naoto Morishita was at the July 1st show and talked about wanting to use both Williams and Bart Gunn, on his shows. It's a bad idea for them. Williams was an awesome high school and college wrestler, but it's been 17 years since he's been in a competitive wrestling match and he's 39 years old and been through the body-destroying wars of All Japan seemingly forever. Barton outboxed a bunch of guys with no boxing experience in the WWF Brawl for All, and he is good size and won some tough man type contests when he was younger, but that's totally different level of primitive tough man to the highest level of NHB fighting against world-class heavyweights. Not that there aren't guys on the scene they probably couldn't beat if they trained for this sort of thing, but not the top-level guys. Williams on a Pride show would garner a lot of interest because of his years as a major pro wrestling star. Barton on an MMA show wouldn't mean much of anything. Morishita announced he wanted Inoki, Kawada, Fujinami and Misawa all at ringside for the Seibu Dome show on August 27th, and that he would attend Misawa's debut show on August 5th. The first show on the tour outside Tokyo was in Numazu on July 4th before a crowd of 1,500 which, all things considered, was considered to be a good sign. Kawada pinned Jinsei Shinzaki in 13:04 with a high kick in what was said to have been a very good match. Williams on Live Audio Wrestling claimed that Vader had already made a deal with Misawa's group. Just before the start of the current tour, Johnny Ace informed the office that he wasn't coming and is expected to take a backstage job with WCW. Ace, who turns 35 in a few weeks, has been a regular with the company dating back to 1988 when he got in because he was the younger brother of Road Warrior Animal, who was a superstar with the company at the time. Ace ended up being a more enduring star in Japan than his older brother and in recent years helped book foreign talent for the company. It was announced on June 30th, just before the foreigners were to arrive on the current tour, that Ace wouldn't be on the tour due to family problems and would be replaced by Hines, as Barton's regular tag team partner, which only lasted 2 days as well. The All Japan style, because of the stiffness, really starts taking its toll on wrestlers when they hit their mid-30s. Ace had apparently been interested elsewhere as he had a tryout more than 1 year ago with the WWF, but WWF wasn't interested in him. At this point, the general feeling among the rest of the foreigners is that they are going to stick with this promotion, feeling that Motoko Baba has the money and will still run a full schedule, although the decision by Ace, who was the closest of all the foreigners to Mrs. Baba, may cause a lot more worrying. Ace had talked with Williams a day or two earlier and indicated he was coming for the tour. When Williams was approached by reporters upon arrival at Narita Airport, he said that Ace had signed with WCW because he needed the money. Kazushi Sakuraba said he wanted to wrestle some shows with All Japan. The family of Jumbo Tsuruta built a 6-foot 4-inch headstone of Tsuruta with his career history on the tombstone, wearing the AWA World Heavyweight title belt. NTV wanted to feature All Japan starting with this week's show, but the company refused to allow the network that canceled them access to tape clips at the shows this past week. All Japan did have brief clips airing on a TV Asahi late-night TV show from the first 2 nights of the tour. Yusuke Wally Yamaguchi, who was Yamaguchi-san as manager of Kaientai at one point with WWF, returned on July 1st as the secondary ref on the tour behind Kyohei Wada. Yamaguchi, who has worked for Gong magazine in Japan for probably a quarter century, was very influential in the All Japan business during the mid-80s, but by the end of the decade was persona non grata with the organization, at least in part for his major influence in starting up the independent scene in Japan with FMW, One Staring and many of the lucha groups. The last 2 TV shows were June 14th, which drew a 1.4, and June 21st, which drew a 2.2. Noah. The promotion officially opens with shows on August 5th and August 6th in their new home base of Differ Ariake. The debut show is tentatively scheduled to be headlined by Kenta Kobashi vs. Jun Akiyama. Tickets go on sale on July 15th, and the office itself will open in the building on July 7th. Kobashi claimed he would be in good shape and appear on the first show after undergoing knee surgery on June 22nd. The first non-All Japan TV show on NTV aired on June 28th. The show didn't start until 2:15 a.m. because a taped baseball game went on forever. The show was a pro wrestling news show which included an interview with Masahiro Chono about the news as well as Jushin Liger, which seems so weird to see on NTV, as well as clips of Big Japan, FMW, Gia and even Pancrase, as well as features on Misawa's promotion. NTV once again approached All Japan this past week about taping the July 23rd Budokan main event with Tenryu, but again All Japan turned them down. New Japan. There have been a ton of injuries already on this tour. Scott Norton was injured on June 29th in Koriyama. It came off like an angle, although the injury is legit, possibly similar to the Vader thing where he is injured so they created an angle for him. During the 6-man tag main event, Takashi Iizuka, who is getting the next IWGP heavyweight title shot at Kensuke Sasaki on July 20th, and badly needs something to get people excited about him as a challenger, put Norton in the armbar. Norton went back to the dressing room during the match, and came back with his arm all taped up. Iizuka went back to work on his arm again using an armbar. Norton then flew home 1 week ahead of schedule. It is said there is an arm injury, but how serious the real injury is right now is unknown. Hiro Saito was also taken off the tour the next day in Ebina, supposedly suffering an injury also at the hands of Iizuka, and on July 3rd in Okayama, Iizuka was given a clean win with a choke sleeper over Hiroyoshi Tenzan. Saito did suffer a broken collarbone. In addition, Michiyoshi Ohara is out with some sort of internal organ disease. Black Cat blew out his knee, Kenzo Suzuki suffered some sort of a back injury, and Katsuyori Shibata is out with a neck injury. Don Frye is out of action with a neck injury until October. They are doing a big angle where Tatsumi Fujinami doesn't want Tokumitsu Ishizawa Kendo Kashin to do the August 27th Pride show at the Seibu Dome, presumably against Henzo Gracie, since it drew huge media attention when they teased that match at the June 4th DSE card, while Antonio Inoki does, as something of an inner power struggle. Atsushi Onita attended the June 30th New Japan show in Ebina doing a confrontation with Riki Choshu to build up the first pay-per-view match. June 10th TV drew a 3.5 rating and June 24th drew a 2.9. Other Japan notes. The July 2nd Genichiro Tenryu vs Shinobu Kandori man vs woman match at Differ Ariake saw them try and do it work shoot style, with Tenryu doing hard punches and kicks to the face, taking her down and getting the mount on her and punching the face along with his traditional hard chops. Kandori did get one judo throw in. Kandori bled heavily and had her left eye nearly shut to make it come off as legit before Harley Saito threw in the towel for her, and they reported she was hospitalized after the match. I know in a sense things like this have gotten over huge in Japanese wrestling. This only drew about a half house for the second show in history at the new arena, but there's something really not entertaining about seeing a man, even in a sport-like situation, beating the hell out of a woman, whether a work or shoot. When Kyoko Inoue fought that much smaller transvestite kickboxer and got her face pounded in, my feeling is it was really sick as a spectacle. It's probably not fair because I can accept a sport two men doing the same to each other. Tenryu on his own war show on July 13th at Korakuen Hall faces H, back under the mask as the original Hayabusa. Atsushi Onita is claiming he's promoting only 3 more shows before retiring, as if, on July 13th in Tokyo, July 15th in Nagoya outdoors, and finally July 20th at the new Diffa Ariake. The July 13th show will be a no-rope barbed wire match with Onita vs Sanshiro Takagi. July 15th will be the six-man tag street fight barbed wire tornado rules match he made popular with Ichiro Yaguchi and Shoji Nakamaki and Great Kendo Nagasaki, defending their titles against Onita and Takagi and Mitsunobu Kikuzawa, plus retirement matches for women wrestlers Rie Nakamura and Crusher Mai Tamari. The Diffa Ariake will have the same main event as Nagoya, plus Onita will also wrestle as Great Nita against Yaguchi in a singles match. It will be Nita's first match under the gimmick since that horrible match last year against Great Muta at Yoyogi Stadium. Don't know if this is anything new, but I've been getting lots of packages from Japan with two different Rikitos and postage stamps, one specifically holding the international heavyweight title belt. Minoru Fujita was injured on the July 3rd Battle Earth show and will miss the AAA show on July 6th in Yokohama and will be replaced by Masamichi Marufuji of Noah. Big Japan ran July 2nd at Korakuen Hall with John Zandig winning the Big Japan Deathmatch heavyweight title in what was billed as a $50,000 winner-take-all match with Big Japan vs Combat Zone Wrestling with lemons, salt and mustard all placed over the barbed wire on boards, beating Tomoaki Honma. Also, Shadow WX and Ryuji Yamakawa regained the Big Japan tag titles from the CZW team of Pain and Wife Beater, and Winger won the Combat Zone Junior title from Acid, which included Winger doing a dive off the 18-foot-high balcony of Korakuen Hall. There were some awesome matches on the last Athena, All Japan Women TV show, topped off by clips of a 30-minute draw with Miho Uekazawa vs Momoe Nakanishi. Nakanishi at this point, even though she's only 20, is one of the best workers, male or female, in the business today. Their most recent TV show blew away, at least for in-ring, any promotion in the world. And for out-of-the-ring video features, probably only trails WWF. Ayako Hamada and Father Grant Hamada won the mixed tag team tournament that Arjun Pride and Michinoku Pro were putting on June 29th at Korakuen Hall, beating Yumi Fukawa and Minoru Tanaka in what was said to have been a really good final match. Miyu Yamamoto, 25, one of the most decorated women amateur wrestlers in history, was originally announced to make her pro wrestling debut on July 14th at the All Japan Women TV tapings, but a few days later it was said the debut would be postponed. I think it's only a one-show deal to build up TV ratings since it's a Fuji TV taping. Yamamoto started at the age of 11 entering the National Age Group Boys Tournament in the 66-pound weight class and winning it. At the age of 15, in 1989, she won her first national women's title and repeated in 1990 and 1991. She captured the 1991 World Championship at 103 pounds and repeated as world champion in 1995. She then retired, got married and had a son. She made a comeback in 1998 and took second in the World Championships, and last year won both the Asian and Japanese national championships. All in all, she's won the Japanese nationals 8 times. She did participate in the famed Queendom Pro Wrestling show at the Tokyo Dome in 1995 doing an amateur match, and had turned down many pro wrestling offers because of the belief that women's wrestling will be introduced in the 2004 Olympics. Here and there. Naoya Ogawa officially vacated the NWA heavyweight title on July 2nd at a press conference. Ogawa gave the idea he was vacating it so he could concentrate on a Tokyo Dome match next May against Rickson Gracie. When asked about the All Japan breakup, he said that fans aren't clamoring for him to wrestle against either Misawa or Kawada, but that people are constantly talking to him about wrestling Gracie. This has been expected for some time, as the agreement for Ogawa to give up the title was actually made about a month back and they were just waiting for the right time to do the official announcement. Ogawa was originally scheduled to drop the title to Gary Steele in England in early June. His dropping the title had been in the works, and he gave a list of people he'd agreed to drop it to, with Steele and Dan Severn topping the list. However, Ogawa claimed due to the shoulder injury he suffered in the April 7th Tokyo Dome match against Shinya Hashimoto that he wouldn't be ready for the England match, and when he didn't go to England, at that point everyone agreed he'd vacate the title and claim it was due to the injury, and a storyline was created. But when he did vacate it, he never mentioned the injury or the England tour and instead talked about Gracie. The plan was for Steele to then defend the title in October at the NWA Anniversary show in Nashville. The working idea now, no time or place has been finalized, is to do a 4-man tournament with Severn, Mike Rapata, one of the members of Ranby Security, on WCW telecasts, Barry Windham and Steele for the title. Dennis Rodman is still being advertised as appearing for 7 wrestling shows in Australia between July 28th and August 13th on a 14-day Superstars of Wrestling tour, generally working against Brutus Beefcake. A rival promotion in Australia is running an August 31st to September 4th tour using local wrestlers and billing former WCW wrestler Blitzkrieg as the headliner. Caught the Discovery Channel special called Wrestling School, based on Rick Baseman's Ultimate Pro Wrestling School in Southern California, which airs on July 11th. The show follows the training and indie matches of several wrestlers, building to a visit to both a practice and a house show by Bruce Pritchard of the WWF, along with following two of the wrestlers to doing a dark match at a SmackDown taping in San Jose and eventually a few of them getting developmental contracts. The highlight of the show is John Cena, who has the look of a young Sting, a physique of a competitive bodybuilder. In fact, there are clips of him in competition, and a tremendous interview delivery in his character of the Prototype, which is a little too corny 80s as a character, but his ability to do an interview in character would probably translate well into any character. Until you see him wrestle in the ring, he looks like a can't miss. Watching him wrestle, you see that he needs a lot of work, but if he gets that down, he has a shot at being a genuine star. One somewhat funny exchange was after he potatoed female wrestler Looney Lane, Jenny Lane, also featured heavily on the show, with a punch, and when he apologized for screwing up, she said it was okay because it made it easier for her to sell it. A highlight of the piece showed him stocking up on groceries for a week with 40 pounds of meat, 35 pounds of chicken, 7 dozen eggs and a few gallons of milk and nothing else, making one ask the obvious question of how he can stay so cut up and muscular eating that volume of food. The show also features a lot of school head instructor Tom Howard, who got a lot of dark match tryouts with WWF last year, and they were about to drop his developmental contract, but at the last minute, after Pritchard saw him work a tag match, renewed it, and he's now under consideration for a spot as Gangrel's partner. Howard, who is in his early 30s, came across as a very nice guy, which he is, but continually questioning himself if he really wants the lifestyle of a pro wrestler, yet also being unable to walk away from it every time he's tried. They focused on several others, including a wired former shoot fighter who ended up not making the grade, despite impressing Pritchard, because he was sentenced to jail on an assault charge and won't be eligible for parole until 2005, and Lane, an attractive but very normal-looking woman, as opposed to a strange tattooed-laden trainee she was often paired with, who grew up as a wrestling fan and has a totally weird outfit and gimmick because her parents don't want her to make it by exploiting her body. Unfortunately, that may sound like good advice, but it doesn't fit this industry. The piece paints a very rosy picture of WWF wrestling, and paints a very realistic picture of how hard it is to get there. It acted as if getting a developmental contract means making it to the WWF, when in reality it's only a step in that direction and only a fraction of those with developmental deals will ever make the big show. It's your typical wrestling school piece, extended to 1 hour. You'll get to see a lot of people learning that you'll probably never hear about again, and one or two who you may say in 5 years you saw them when they first started out. Speaking of which, after seeing tapes, I've got to say that Shawn Michaels must be almost as good a teacher as he is a wrestler. Michaels TWA is the best indie TV show around, largely due to the very good in-ring matches. The ring work is very reminiscent of a mid-80s Stampede Wrestling, when it was spawning Owen Hart, Jushin Liger, Benoit, Pillman, Johnny Smith, Hiroshi, etc. You're seeing some inexperienced guys who already put on great matches. The star is a guy called Spanky, who's already moving on to Memphis. He's a fun worker to watch with a lot of charisma, but very small. A little larger and a guy with real potential was American Dragon, who no doubt gets his name from Ultimo Dragon. He does a lot of high flying and hits his spot like a pro as opposed to an indie guy. Aside from the fact he tries to do too many in one match, he's a great worker for the stage of the career he's at. The other name that has been mentioned coming out of there, Lance Cade, who has worked a few FMW tours, is someone Michaels has totally patterned after a young Barry Windham in terms of looks. They are similar size and build, although Cade doesn't have the charisma and working ability Windham had even early in his career. Even though Michaels is bad when he tries to do color on Raw for an indie level color guy, he's really good, and his just being on the show gives it a lot more major league aura than any other indie TV show out there. Entertainment Weekly ran an article in this past issue about the proposed Urban Wrestling Federation, and RLR Associates and PPI Entertainment is looking at putting together to specifically target African American pro wrestling fans by combining hip-hop music with wrestling. The Edmonton Sun and the Edmonton Journal on June 30th both gave a 4 stars review to Beyond the Mat, which opened there that evening. The only movies in recent months to get better reviews were American Beauty and Being John Malkovich. Phil Mushnick wrote a tremendous column on June 30th on the New York media's handling of John Rocker and what it bred. A lot of wrestling fans won't like it because there were a lot of wrestling knocks in the column because he tied an MCI WorldCom's pulling out of WWF to the story, basically saying that was a real news story that the New York media ignored while they created and blew up a fake news story of Rocker coming to New York out of proportion to create news themselves and lead to the circus-like environment and national story where the city had to add 600 extra police for the 4-game homestand to Shea Stadium because Rocker was in town. He said this created story led to sending scores of extra reporters and camera crews to Shea looking for fans to be outraged at him knowing how people would react to get on camera. K-Town SmackDown on June 30th in Knoxville did a couple of big angles. Jimmy Goldman, who won the Battle Royal on June 23rd, demanded his $10,000 from promoter Ron Fuller. Fuller didn't give him the money, saying he first had to beat Buddy Landel, who was his scheduled opponent on the show but wasn't there, announced as being due to injuries suffered at last week's show. Fuller said he'd give him the money if he could beat the Mongolian Stomper next week. I can't believe I'm writing about Mongolian Stomper in the year 2000. The main event saw Tracy Smothers and Steve Armstrong reunite as the Southern Boys against the OVW team of Russ McCulloch and Robbie D, managed by Jim Cornette and Sin. Cornette ended up throwing a fireball at Bob Armstrong to set up a lumberjack match between the two as next week's main event. Terry Landell wasn't at the show, but to keep that rivalry going, or if it is one, I know that Cornette certainly isn't aware of any working, and actually at one of the recent shows literally as a shoot tried to strangle Landell and had to be held back by the police. Landell, no relation to Buddy, is running a free show in the parking lot across the street from this group on July 6th. Fuller had a piece of paper passed out at the show saying that Landell was running a free show across the street. Ricky Morton, who has worked for Fuller as recently as a few weeks ago on top, main eventing against Jeff Anderson, to try and run K-Town Showdown Promotions out of business, and warned fans that because the show was free that the quality wouldn't be as good as his show. Sabu vs. Terry Funk headlines the XPW show on July 22nd, the Los Angeles Sports Arena. Sabu worked over the weekend for Stampede Wrestling and came not only with Pee Wee Moore but also with Josh Lazia of XPW. Sabu was looking at bringing some of the Stampede guys to XPW. Howard Brody's first show at the Fort Homer Hesterly Armory in Tampa, the home of Tuesday Night Wrestling back in the 1970s glory days of championship wrestling from Florida, takes place on August 15th. Curtis Thompson and Drake Dawson defending the NWA tag titles against Rick Michaels and David Young is on the bill, as well as a tag match involving 4 wrestlers who at various times worked the building in its glory years with the Bushwhackers, formerly the Sheepherders, against Steve Kieran and Brian Blair. Kendall Windham is also on the show, as well as a tournament for a Florida heavyweight title. The Sports Illustrated piece on myself appeared on page 30 of the July 1st issue. MMA. Tito Ortiz suffered assorted scrapes and bruises and some ankle ligament damage one day into his honeymoon when he and his wife were run over by a bus in Bermuda while riding on a moped. His wife Kirsten suffered 4 broken vertebrae and 3 broken ribs, and they were rushed home to California on an ICU plane. Ortiz wasn't used to driving on the left side of the road and forgot to look right while entering a road and was struck by the bus. Ortiz said the injury won't prevent him from headlining the September 22nd UFC show and that he would be able to start back training next week. At this point, he has no challenger scheduled for his UFC middleweight title. The second Dream Stage Entertainment pay-per-view aired on July 1st on DirecTV in the US, which was a tape of the June 4th show from Nagoya. I can't imagine the show doing very well, as we heard literally no feedback on it after the show, as opposed to the first DSC show where we got nearly as much feedback as we would to a major pro wrestling pay-per-view show. The reality is that it's virtually impossible, and I know UFC has done it but nobody else has been able to promote successful pay-per-view events without either strong mainstream media hype or strong television to promote it. The internet isn't anywhere near strong enough these days. Someday that may be the case, but we are years away from it. DSC did relatively well for the first show, but that was because it had the biggest tournament in history, and both Hoist Gracie and Ken Shamrock, who were the 2 biggest UFC draws during the period, it was doing a huge buy rate and when its videos were mass distributed. More important, I don't see the ability to draw for shows that took place 1 month in the past. Pay-per-view is an immediacy thing. The first DSC did well because reports were out it was one of the best MMA shows in history, so the insiders knew it was a can't-miss show. You're only going to get lucky with that every so often, and the June 4th show was a dull show. So you are really limiting yourself presenting a taped show that insiders already knew was dull, whereas with a live show, you don't know ahead of time. I don't know if DSC has a prayer of making it, as other Japanese shows, Pancrase, UWFI, did very well for their debut show but never did business again. Realistically, unless it can get on cable, it doesn't. But at best, it needs a quicker turnaround where if shows can't air live due to the time difference, they air on only a few hours tape delay so the live feel is still there. ECW. Although no actual deal nor have any direct conversations taken place between Psychosis and Paul Heyman, he is expected to appear on both the July 8th ECW Arena show as well as the pay-per-view show at this point, as he canceled a booking in Oregon that would have coincided with the ECW Arena show. Bobby Eaton also debuts on July 8th and may be paired with Danny During and Roadkill. There is scheduled to be a going-away party for Raven at the show and that he'd finish up there. Paul Heyman had indicated during the week that he wasn't in a rush now to give Raven a contract release. The WWF's response is that he'll start being pushed either when he gets the release from Heyman and is then able to sign a WWF contract, or after August 26, when his ECW contract expires. There were no TV tapings this weekend, as this coming week's show will be from the previous week's card in Villa Park, Illinois. This coming weekend will have TV tapings from both Poughkeepsie on July 7th as well as the ECW Arena for 2 weeks' worth of television. They ran house shows in Kansas City and Wichita, which both drew about 750, far less than the debuts in both cities. This was the second time in, and there was, due to budgetary tightening, virtually no promotion in either market. In Kansas City, Van Dam debuted a new move where he did a springboard drop kick all the way across the ring, not halfway across but literally to the other side of the ring, into a chair into the face of Scotty Anton. He did the same move the next night with Roadkill. He'll probably use it against Anton on the pay-per-view, and it was said to be one of the most amazing spots anyone has ever seen. Casey Main was Dreamer and Sandman and Raven over Corino and Victory and Credible. Even though Raven has gotten no push in a long time, with the exception of Van Dam, he still gets the second best crowd reaction of anyone on the shows along with Sandman. At this point he's mainly doing comedy spots and not taking many bumps, clearly trying to avoid getting hurt before going to WWF. Chris Hamrick was still out with a shoulder injury. Easy Money has tightened up his physique and everyone is raving about him, particularly having a good match with Tao. Texas indie wrestler Red Dog, Rodney Bigno, debuted on the undercards. In Wichita, the headliner was Dreamer and Raven and Sandman and Tao over Rhino and Victory and Corino and Credible. Kid Cash turned a power bomb by Money, who was standing on the top rope, into a Hurricane Rana for the pin. Vic Grimes' WWF contract wasn't renewed. The feeling seems to be that he didn't improve on his in-ring work and conditioning over the year he was under contract. He is technically still with ECW, but hasn't been used because he moved back to Northern California, and with money being tight, they aren't going to fly him in. There are lots of rumors that the July 8th ECW Arena show will be the final one in the building, but right now plans are to return on August 19th. The Dallas debut on July 28th got off to a strong advance. TNN's show on June 30th was taped in Milwaukee. No matter how good some of the matches themselves were, it doesn't matter because the lack of lighting at the rave made the thing come off as totally Bush League. They did the same open they always do. This time, before anything could happen with Cyrus and Styles and Gertner, Lynn came out and did an insincere babyface-type role, holding a TNN mic, to get him over as a heel. Lynn piledrove ref Danny Daniels after agreeing to be the second ref to Daniels in the first match, which was Tao versus Guido. Guido was now called Little Guido Maritato, thereby giving his character a last name, which coincidentally happens to also be his real last name. They pushed during this match that a star from Nitro would be jumping to ECW. It's so sad when, as bad as WCW is, ECW puts them over like WCW is the big leagues on ECW's own TV, and they're happy getting any crumbs that WCW whisks away. Guido bled heavily. Tao accidentally dropkicked Lynn out of the ring, and he missed Big Sal interfering and splashing Tao for Guido's win in 5:53. Good TV bout. The big star was Gorgeous George in a dressing room, kind of doing a tease on Sinister Minister and Mikey Whipwreck, who at least did a hell of a job putting her over as something hot. She's now just George, since WCW owns the name Gorgeous George. Mikey proclaimed that she was worth $1,000 for 2 minutes. Francine was to wrestle Jazz. They bleep all kinds of things off this show, but Jazz was allowed to call Francine a douchebag. Credible interfered and he and Francine put the boots to Jazz. Dreamer came out and it turned into a mixed tag. Pretty bad match, ending with Dreamer pinning Credible with a diamond cutter in 6:34, with them acting like it was some move Dreamer came up with and called it a Tommyhawk. Tommyhawk is actually an 80s wrestling term for when the lame-ass announcers who didn't know English in those days used to call Wahoo McDaniel's finisher Tommyhawk chop. Corino and Victory attacked Jazz after Incredible hit Dreamer with a cane shot and he juiced heavily. Credible gave him the tombstone on barbed wire and Francine covered Dreamer as Credible counted the fall. Main event was Van Dam vs Rhino for the TV title. Good match with a lousy finish, not just the easy DQ but the total lack of building to any finish. Anton just shoved Van Dam off the top rope and Cyrus hit the ref for a DQ in 7:47. Rhino speared him after. A lot of good moves but no build. Van Dam was cleaning house on Corino and Victory after until Credible hit him with a cane and they pounded him down. They pushed the idea that Credible had joined the network. Van Dam did a dive on everyone except Credible, allowing Sandman to hit the ring to lay out Credible with a ton of cane shots and a leg sweep with the cane to set up Credible versus Sandman for next week. WCW. Nitro took place on July 3 in Charleston, West Virginia before 6,265 fans, which was 5,359 paying $99,195 in a building set up for 13,337. Neither Bischoff nor Russo were at the show. Most expect Russo to return on July 10. Supposedly there are problems with the finish of the main event on July 9, although so much BS is thrown out there and since it involves Bischoff, Russo, and Hogan, everything has to be taken as a possible angle. Originally when this match was made, Hogan was supposed to win the title from Jarrett. Supposedly the idea now is for Jarrett to go over. But Hogan, who has creative control in his contract, is balking. Hogan was originally scheduled to return on July 3 to shoot an angle to build up the match, but since Hogan didn't like the finish, he balked at pushing it and didn't come to television. It wasn't a no-show, in that by the time they wrote the TV, they knew Hogan wasn't going to be there, he wasn't in the script. It had been planned all along for Hogan not to appear on TV until the week before the pay-per-view in order to sell the idea he was injured in the original attack. In this company who knows what is and isn't an angle, only that whatever the angle, it probably will never draw money at the end, but the story going around is that they want Hogan to do the job. And in his contract he has creative control and is refusing to do so. It could be true, but it also could be another of those deals like they did at Havoc last year, which, in hindsight, can be directly pointed to for when the buy rates started plummeting for good, but that never stopped Dusty Rhodes from killing more cities in the 80s after he'd killed the good ones by overdoing screw job finishes. Show started with 3 count versus Dragons. Shane Helms was injured immediately so Abbott took his spot. Abbott KO'd Yang with a punch. Yang sold it exactly like John Machua reacted in Abbott's UFC debut, which actually is what made his name, working going into the exact same kind of convulsions for a legit scary knockout, and more pinned him in 324. This is actually good use of Abbott. Awesome was power bombing all kinds of people backstage. Not nearly as funny as the exact same angle they did with Kanyon the previous Wednesday. They kept pushing Hall's return hard. Goldberg did an interview which was almost identical to Bret Hart 1997 interviews after he first turned heel. Nash came out and they did a pull-apart. The story was that both Goldberg and Nash wanted each other, but Eric, on the phone, wanted the match saved for the pay-per-view. Kat, as commissioner, booked a battle royal with both in it. Johnny the Bull beat Funk in a hardcore match in 6:32. Fans got really into this match as the two worked very hard. Funk was bleeding from the left eye hard way from something that apparently happened when they were throwing things at each other in the stands. Johnny did a springboard leg drop from the ring onto a chair on the floor, which looked phenomenal. Virtually everyone who heard about the move in the dressing room warned him against doing it, for good reason. He fell off the ropes the first time, but went back and did it again. He was totally messed up doing the move and hospitalized with what was believed to be a broken pelvis. He immediately told Funk to pin him. Funk wasn't supposed to win, and end the match. Funk, apparently feeling this was the match that was going to make him, refused to change the finish in the ring and kept it going another minute before he felt it was time to go home. Johnny looked in incredible pain being carried from the ring. Although this isn't confirmed, nobody was expecting him back for the pay-per-view on Sunday, nor back any time in the near future as he was throwing up backstage and had blood in his urine. Funk kicked out of several near falls before being pinned after a DDT on a chair. They showed a clip of Asya being blown up practicing her ring entrance by the pyro. Vampiro, dressed as Sting, gave Torborg his demon costume while another guy dressed like a monk, Chris Daniels, was in the background. General Rection and Corporal Cajun earned a tag title shot on July 10, beating Mark Jindrak and Sean O'Hare in 4:05 when Rection pinned Jindrak after a moonsault. Jindrak looked really green. O'Hare did a very bad-looking splash off the top onto Rection. Stasiak and Palumbo laid out all 4 guys, plus Major Stash and Lieutenant Loco after the match, but the MIA made a comeback. Jarrett did an interview and brought up some fat women to sing for the end of Hogan's career. The idea of putting this segment at 9 p.m. was mind-boggling to say the least, as it was just about the worst segment on Nitro in months, and you know what kind of ground that covers. They brought out a fat snooty guy who they called Galen Chandler as the head of standards and practices to get mad about the skit because they were calling the women fat, and Jarrett hit him with a guitar shot and laid him out dead. The funny thing is, and this is almost too funny to be true, that the head of SANP at the show is named Galen Chandler, as that almost had to be this puffy made-up name. However, the guy who took the guitar shot was an actor playing the role of Chandler because the real Chandler refused to do the angle. You know things are bad when guys who have never even been on TV are refusing to do your angles. It's so humorous to keep having them blame SANP for their failures to write any creative angles when the other side is being scrutinized and has been forced to clean up SmackDown, and the result of cleaning up the show was the ratings went substantially up, yet WCW uses the crutch they can't get risque for their ratings not going up. Booker T beat Douglas in 307 with a totally botched up, or a nage. Douglas appeared really shaken up after the match as he couldn't even join in the beatdown with Kanyon. Douglas has refused to get his neck checked, apparently afraid of what they may find, and he doesn't want to take any time off. Bagwell was originally to be T's partner against Kanyon and Douglas, but he missed the show apparently due to transportation problems. Demon beat Vampiro in 307 when a whole bunch of people in Sting outfits came out and distracted Vampiro, and Demon pinned him with a love gun, which I guess means a bad-looking Cobra Clutch Slam. All the Stings surrounded Vampiro, but the lights went out and Vampiro disappeared into thin air. David Flair was kissing up to Daphne again, saying it was another guy making out with Hancock. Hancock was wearing a short wedding dress in the ring and David was somewhat paying attention. Crowbar came out and threatened to cut Hancock's hair. David pretended he was sick as an excuse to leave Daphne and hit the ring. Daphne came out and poured Pepto-Bismol all over David. David hit Crowbar with 2 chair shots and cut Daphne's hair, then put the hair and the clippers in Crowbar's hand, so Daphne blamed him when she turned around. Daphne and Hancock rolled around on the ground. Let's just say this did nothing to whet anyone's appetite to see them actually do a match on pay-per-view, as the whole skit came off far worse than it reads. Disco and Conan brought out Mysterio Jr. and Guerrero dressed up like Kidman and Storm. There was a lot of comedy on this show, but this was the only thing actually funny. The best part was Mysterio Jr., as Storm, saying he was from Calgary, Alberta, Canada. Storm hasn't been in WCW long enough for any trademark phrases to stick or be parodied. Only a small percentage of the audience actually knows Storm's catchphrase. It was something only for the insiders and the small percentage of WCW audience that watches ECW. I thought it was hilarious. They also had a good match on the show, ending with Mysterio Jr. pinning Kidman after a bulldog off the top rope onto a chair when Conan and Disco both interfered in 353. FAs attacked them after. The interference was explained, because there is supposed to be no interference in matches on Nitro, on the fact that Cat was having sex with Tigress for all of 2 minutes, which is the average length of time of a match on Nitro. Awesome did an interview designed to get the crowd to chant mullet at him. Finally, instead of a battle royal, it was just Nash killing a whole group of heels one by one. Cat wouldn't let the faces save him, as if he needed help since he wasn't selling to begin with, but finally they did. I guess the idea would be for Goldberg to come in when Nash was down and start beating on him, but since Nash wasn't selling, it kind of ruined that obvious structural idea. Goldberg kicked Nash once. Everyone cleared the ring and Nash kicked Goldberg off the apron to the floor and the bell rang at 3:19, so apparently Nash won the Battle Royal. It was really bad. Backstage at the June 27th tapings in Lincoln, Nebraska, Scott Steiner threw what was reported by several different sources as a totally unprofessional fit regarding being asked to do the job for Mike Awesome. Geez, and it wasn't even a clean job. Steiner claimed he was lied to and reportedly threatened to beat up Terry Taylor, who came back saying he'd sue if that were to happen. Steiner reputedly called him a nasty name for threatening to sue. This is hardly the first time Steiner has blown up at management, or even once or twice, on live broadcasts, and was suspended earlier this year when he went against the script to do a nonsensical interview somehow blaming Ric Flair for the decline of the company's ratings. This will clearly continue to happen as long as WCW refuses to put its foot down and eliminate wrestlers who are unprofessional and, whether it be Taylor or Vince Russo, gives the scriptwriters a lot more authority to not use talent that won't cooperate. Of course, Russo rewarded Steiner for his outburst on Flair by trying to make a hero out of him for it because it was someone else's script and not his TV show Steiner was screwing with. This meant that Steiner, the last time he pulled something like this, was ultimately rewarded for it and then promised the biggest singles push of his career. And there is a correlation, and everyone knows it and knows why, between the wrestlers with the best physiques also having the shortest fuses. See Bill Goldberg as example B, as there is a lot of controversy because he was unhappy from the start about the heel turn and is heavily pushing a la Sting when they tried the same thing with him late last year, to be turned back and has had a noted short fuse since his return, but WCW turns a blind eye to that obvious problem as well. Steiner was pulled from the TV tapings but scheduled back for the pay-per-view. That'll really send a strong message to the locker room about threatening to beat up your boss. Bischoff was in Lincoln, but had left the building to fly to either California or Arizona before the outburst. Some were saying that once Bischoff left, it was the cat's away so the mice will play attitude. The handling of the situation the way it was just shows that the revolving door list of bookers is going to continue to revolve, and the idea that the inmates are running the asylum isn't going to change at least this week. Kevin Nash reportedly had an exchange with Taylor a few weeks back as well, although it was just a smart-ass comment and not any kind of a threat. Taylor gives the impression that he believes he's very smart when it comes to wrestling booking. The only impression I can say is that he is smarter than most, and of his 4 TVs, 2 were pretty good, 1 was okay and 2 weren't good, which gives him a perfectly average track record. Nash allegedly said to him if he was so smart about wrestling, how come he never drew a dime? I know the irony in that statement regarding Nash, and we could list probably more promoters who made millions with their ideas that never drew a dime as an active performer than those who did the Great American Bash pay-per-view drew and 0.19 buy rate, which would be about a $935,000 company gross on the show. That's with the combination of teasing Hogan's retirement, Flair's retirement, and the announcement that was supposed to change the entire face of the pro wrestling industry, and they did a buy rate along the lines of what ECW does with 1 hour of relatively low-rated TV with no lighting. WCW has attempted to spin that as a success by stating it's a 25% increase over the previous month's show. Brad Siegel has made it clear that he doesn't want Scott Hall back, this, of course, after they've started the angle on television to bring him back. If this is true, and after watching Nitro this week it's almost impossible to believe it is since they pushed Hall so hard, it either means that previous statement is a major work, or WCW is really even more incompetent a promotion than it seemed to be up to this point. From what we were told at press time, while the plan wasn't for Hall to be back, there is a good chance he will be by Sunday. It's a long, complicated story having to do with Hall's personal life. Apparently he and his wife are back on the outs, which, even though he's always a complete mess when that happens, when he's a complete mess, they always take him back. Hall's track record with the company is enough for any executive to make that decision, particularly after his last stint ended with him being bombed and causing so much trouble in England that he wasn't even allowed to fly home with the rest of the crew, thus missing the Nitro at the Nassau Coliseum, which was the final Nitro before a pay-per-view that he was thrown into the main event of, largely because they recognized that Jeff Jarrett versus Sid Vicious in a singles match on top wasn't strong enough. Of course, adding Hall didn't mean anything for buys either. He then showed up for Thunder the next day and made a threat against J.J. Dillon, which caused the live event at the Spectrum to be held up for some 40 minutes and him being told to leave, and not appearing on that show either. There may be an added deal because Siegel's niece, Emily Sherman, was dating Hall, who is back with wife Dana, on and off for several years, and from all accounts was a very stormy relationship. If this isn't a work, Siegel is probably making the right decision, and virtually everyone in the company I'm in contact with agreed on this point, including friends of Hall, based on Hall's track record, that the lack of communication in the company is really scary when they start an angle, which specifically teases Hall's return without getting it as solid as would be possible, given we're dealing with Hall, who is always a question mark himself, before clearing that he could even be brought back. It was expected that Hall was going to be fired, or at least sent home permanently, after the incident in Europe and Philadelphia, after he completed the advertised main event at Super Brawl at the Cow Palace. Hall suffered a legit very serious neck injury from a guitar shot which wound up with him in ICU and eventually undergoing surgery that he's been out recovering from, and thus due to the timing, avoided being fired. Hall has been earning $16,000 per week, half pay on his $1.6 million annual contract, while sitting out the injury, which, it should be noted, amounts to roughly double what he made in his best year in the WWF as Razor Ramon. This does bring to mind a story Ted DiBiase told on Wrestling Observer Live regarding the famous incident in the early 80s when Terry Gordy gave him all the pile drivers. Although there was absolutely nothing wrong with him, DiBiase, it was done in those days to get angles over, was taken to the hospital and actually spent 1 week in the hospital working everyone and loading up on D-Moral for the phantom injury because it was believed you had to make things seem totally legit for the angle to draw money. In other words, it is hardly a never-before-done deal in wrestling for a pro to be able to work a phantom injury, although once you go to the extent of actual surgery, I'd think that would be an extreme work. Hennig's contract expired this past week. No word on his future. WCW's TV ads for Nitro on July 3 in Charleston, West Virginia advertised, among others, Sid Vicious and Lex Luger as appearing. Vampiro vs. Demon in a graveyard match was added to the Bash at the Beach pay-per-view. In Japan they are saying that Great Muta will debut on the July 10th Nitro, and that he hadn't started because he was busy trying to find an apartment in Atlanta. We'll see. I guess that sounds better than the bookers haven't figured out how to use him. Candido is apparently gone. He suffered a broken wrist and at this point has been dropped. He's on the payroll through September, and if they come up with an idea for him before that time he could conceivably be brought back, but that isn't the plan right now. Apparently Bischoff was mad because they set up to debut the Triple Threat, and Candido immediately showed up injured and was felt Bigelow showed up out of shape. Douglas suffered a neck injury on the Thunder show on June 27 during a match taped for Worldwide when Wall didn't release him fast enough when delivering a DDT. Douglas appeared to be knocked out momentarily, and wasn't able to lift Wall twice for his Fisherman Buster, Pittsburgh Plunge finisher. Douglas was told to get checked out in the hospital, but refused, and by later in the night was telling people he was fine. He worked Nitro on Monday, and seemed a little off until messing up taking a Uranage from Booker T and apparently landing wrong because he seemed really out of it in the ring after the match was over and unable to join in the beatdown. There is very much an attitude in the company among the guys who are hungry for positions as to ignore injuries because they could lose their spot, not to mention the pay cut. Mysterio Jr.'s knee is really bad once again because he's been doing far more than he should. There is talk of making Stevie Ray a color commentator, which sounds hilarious on the surface. Ray does have a good smart-ass critical demeanor backstage that doesn't come through while doing his stereotypical interviews, but even at that, it sounds like a long shot. Major Guns, Tylene Buck, was injured the afternoon of the show doing a run-through of the planned three-way with Paisley and Tigress for Thunder, and her implant had a problem, so she couldn't work the show but was back on Monday. A couple of notes regarding the huge money losses WCW has taken and will continue. The loss of WCW Saturday Night once again takes more potential ad revenue away from WCW. I'll be honest, since I never thought of this myself. I was actually at the beach on July 4th and saw some friends from the past, and the subject of wrestling came up, and of all the things in wrestling today, the first thing they brought up was the cancellation of WCW Saturday Night, they being from the original cable generation when 3 p.m. on Saturday meant wrestling on TBS for as long as there was national cable, as one actually saw the final show, and how they just barely at the end of the show mentioned the show was ending, and they couldn't believe after watching it for 21 years it ended just like that. It made me realize that after 27 years in the same time slot, well, there was a brief period when it was moved 1 hour later. It really should have done a huge farewell show with old clips like most long-lasting TV series do and get one last nostalgia rating by doing it. At press time we don't know where the ratings for the new show will come in, but for argument's sake, if we predict a 1.0, that means 1.0 worth of ads instead of maybe 2.8 worth, 1.4 times 2 hours, or a 64% drop in WCW revenue coming out of Saturday television. This coincides with a 42% drop in Monday television ad revenue since the start of this year. For TNT as a network, when Nitro switched from being a 3-hour show to a 2-hour show, for the network to break even on the revenue from the switch based on what the show is doing in the 3-hour mode against football late last year, 3.2 average, that they would have needed to raise it to a 4.5 to 4.7 over the 2 hours, and for WCW to break even by going back to 2 hours. Based on last year's number, it would have to average a 4.8 rating. 3 hours of a 3.2 average equals 9.6 total ratings points on Monday to sell ad time with. 2 hours at 2.8 equals 5.6, which means ad revenue from Monday night has theoretically dropped 42% since January by making the switch. That's assuming the costs have stayed stagnant, although actually production costs have risen greatly this year. The switch was probably necessary for everyone's long-term sanity, but it was a major contributing factor to the huge losses the company is piling up, since many TV viewers that once did no longer attend house shows, and seemingly nobody any longer buys WCW pay-per-view shows, and merchandise is way down. But there are at least a decent amount of television viewers that watch but aren't interested enough in the angles and product to spend money on it, but not disinterested enough to not watch television. The theory going to 2 hours would result in ratings increasing, and it absolutely should have, between NFL season being over and eliminating the lowest rated hour of the three going against WWF, has worked out to be just the opposite. The costs of production of a 2-hour show are almost identical to a 3, since most of the costs are flying people in, setting up, etc. After undergoing shoulder surgery, Flair is still targeting September as his probable return. Hogan delivered a political endorsement that backfired. I guess it's bad enough a group wanted to use Hogan with all his credibility on TV ads in the first place, but they got what they deserved. The ad has Hogan telling voters in Clearwater, Florida to vote for a $300 million downtown revitalization project which is up for a vote on July 11th. Hogan said it would create 2,000 new jobs and result in $3 million going to improve the schools. In the commercial, Hogan, who said he and his family have made their home in Clearwater for more than 12 years, said he was going to vote for the bill. As it turns out, Hogan actually doesn't live in Clearwater, although he does live near the city limits, and isn't a registered voter. The sponsors of the bill called the ad an honest mistake and pulled it when the embarrassing info became public. VENTURA is back working with ICP. Violent J is helping produce a record for Psychopathic Records, ICP's label, that VENTURA will do called Thrillful for a November release. VENTURA will do some music tour dates with ICP at that time to push the record. ICP also wants back in WCW since they love doing pro wrestling and nobody else will have them. VENTURA will also work an ICP show on July 22nd in Detroit. Hogan went on one of his nonsensical rambles on Bubba the Love Sponge ripping on Mark Madden. Apparently Hogan got word that Madden had a discussion with Mickey J saying that it's time to get rid of Hogan. Hogan claimed Madden always rips him, and when he confronted Madden about it, Madden told him it was all working an angle. Actually, there was no such discussion between the two. Hogan used his own phrase when he was confronted about his remarks, couldn't headline a flea market show about Kidman, and apparently decided that is what Madden would have said if he had been confronted, since that's what, well, you get the picture. Roddy Piper is being brought to Denver on July 14th for a first-day tickets sale for the August 7th Nitro. At this point there are no plans to bring Piper back to television, although at some point, since he's under contract for several more pay-per-view matches, it's bound to happen. Most of the reports are that the backstage atmosphere has improved greatly with so many of the big stars not around at TV, in particular Hogan. Thunder tapings on June 27th in Lincoln, Nebraska drew 3,965 fans, which was 3,439, paying $93,938. WWF. In the New York Times, after winning the lawsuit, Viacom chairman Sumner Redstone proclaimed it as a much more important victory for us than most people will know, saying that in particular, it will benefit TNN and up the profile of the station. USA Network tried to downplay the loss, with President Stephen Chow being quoted as saying the loss of WWF programming will have a negligible effect on our ratings. I can't believe he'd even say something that's stupid, and will have a positive effect on our profits. USA executives, in trying to downplay the loss, which if it wasn't such a big deal they wouldn't have gone to such great lengths as far as filing a suit to keep the shows, because other shows could be more profitable in the time slot, because wrestling programming is not as profitable as the ratings indicate, since WWF got most of the advertising time to sell on its own. But during the trial itself, it was stated that wrestling was highly profitable and the crown jewel in the schedule because it was USA's highest rated programming. Actually, that could be taken both ways. At $5.2 million per year in rights fees, the show no doubt was highly profitable, because ratings over the next year wouldn't figure to increase much, and more likely would slightly decline. Upping that same rights fee to $26 million would have made the wrestling franchise a lot less profitable next season for USA had it won the suit. Judge William Chandler's ruling was that USA failed to match the Viacom offer because it didn't match the promises to offer equal promotion of the product on radio and billboards, nor did it agree not to ever preempt the wrestling shows. Viacom agreed to that, for the dog show or tennis in its bid. Chandler said by USA not matching those points it didn't match the proposal for the wrestling shows themselves. Chandler ruled that USA did not have an obligation to match the package as it pertained to book deals, broadcasting XFL football, or airing non-wrestling programming and helping fund non-wrestling programming produced by WWF. The actual after-tax profit of the WWF for the fiscal year ending April 30th was $50,209,000, as opposed to $33,231,000 for the fiscal year ending April 30th, 1999. For the fiscal year, the company took in $379,310,000 and ended with a before-tax profit of $77,165,000 on the business and another $5,416,000 in other income such as interest income, for a total pre-tax profit of $82,581,000. The actual profit for the first quarter of 2000, even with the record pay-per-view grosses and record revenue, after taxes, was $12,773,000. A very slight decline from the same period a year ago because the company had lower expenses last year in addition to legal fees and some money already spent on XFL startup, as mentioned last week.
The July 23rd fully loaded pay-per-view will be headlined by Rock vs. Benoit for the WWF title, Triple H vs. Jericho and Angle vs. Undertaker, so they are giving Benoit, Jericho and Angle each their highest profile matches on this show. They are putting Benoit with Shane as his manager.
I think it's real important the buy rate stays at a competitive level or else fingers will be pointed at people for not being main event caliber. Rock vs. Benoit and a Triple H vs. Jericho should be great matches if they're shorter TV bouts that have already taken place or any indication. I have no idea how Angle is going to be able to get a match out of Undertaker. Whether you want to chalk this up to being perceptive paranoid, or simply that plans change so quickly in wrestling that looking back a few weeks makes things not make sense, there is an awareness that Benoit and Jericho are coming off pay-per-views where they were eliminated in the first round and coming off no major wins each, and in both cases, one or more major losses, and are now expected to draw a pay-per-view from the main event position. Raw is the funniest show on television took place on July 3rd in Orlando, Florida. Whoever came up with the repartee in the various Foley segments needs to be given a major raise and Foley needs to be working in a comedy sitcom. The wrestling wasn't bad, either. Benoit beat Guerrero via DQ in 4:17 when China interfered. After the match, Benoit KO'd Guerrero with a belt shot and put the crossface on China, who sold it big. At least someone did on the show. Since it was a European title match, Benoit couldn't win clean. Aside from Guerrero messing up a victory roll spot, it was a hell of a TV match. Foley came out to a big pop. He joked that he thought Hexstrand, Road Warrior Hawk, was behind him because the pop was so big. The Road Warriors used to incessantly talk about how big their pops were, even in their sad final days in the WWF when their pops weren't any larger than anyone else's. Rock and Shane came out to set up Rock vs. Shane for the title as the main event. Triple H double countout Rikishi in an IC title match in 4:31. Ross called Rikishi the Sultan of SWAT, which was Babe Ruth's old nickname, although I'm sure it was meant as an inside reference to Rikishi formerly being the Sultan. Match was passable. Jericho rammed Triple H into the ring steps after the match and Rikishi gave him the stinky face. Do you realize Trish Stratus has never looked the same since he did that to her? Venus beat Jeff Hardy in 5:55 with a money shot. Real good match. Stratus distracted the ref while Taz choked Jeff out. Foley said there would be a handicap match with Jericho vs. Dog and X-Pac, but then came out and said he didn't mention it was a 3-on-2 and Jericho's partners would be the Acolytes. Jericho pinned X-Pac in 3:55 with a lionsault in another good match. They teased a spot where Jericho took a Bradshaw tag in place of Farouk, who made a dirty face. Triple H threw food all over the dressing room. Undertaker and Kane beat Edge and Christian via DQ in a mop-up. Inc. got no offense. Angle hit Undertaker in the knee with a scepter for the DQ in 2:24. It actually didn't stink for action, but they should have at least allowed the tag champs some offense, even if they should have done a lot of bouncing around as well, since they were also being laid out after the match. The only reason this isn't going to end up like Kidman in the Hogan feud is that Inc. are so funny on the mic they can somewhat get away with it. Undertaker didn't sell the shot much anyway. Kane choke slammed Edge after while Taker powerbombed Christian. Angle did an interview saying he was helping out his friends and meant no ill will toward Undertaker. Malenko beat Crash in 2:02 after a powerbomb in a real good short match for the light heavy strap. Jacqueline and Ivory attacked Malenko after the match. Foley and Briscoe did one of the funniest promos ever with Briscoe begging Foley to cancel the Rock vs. Shane match since Shane was hurt. Dudley's beat Angle and Brooklyn Brawler in 3:50 when Angle walked out on his partner, who got the 3D. After the match they power-bombed Brawler through a table. Another real good match even with Brawler involved. Test pinned Godfather in 1:52 after an elbow. Steven Richards put Sax over the hose in his role as censor. While I hated it on SmackDown because WWF doesn't need to be provoking bad publicity, on Raw, which the PTC doesn't watch, the character was real funny. Snow read this funny as hell and totally stupid goodbye poem to Blackman, who was attacked by all the lowest rungs of WWF talent, Posse and Kaientai, trying to get the hardcore title while Snow was oblivious to it all. Rock beat Shane in all of 10 seconds via DQ when Benoit interfered and put Rock in the crossface after a few chair shots. Shane beat up 5 refs while Benoit held the hold for about 2 minutes. Foley finally came out to get Benoit off. Rock got up and sold way too little considering the circumstances, so Shane is now managing Benoit, which is great for Benoit. July 4th tapings were in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. The show came about 1,000 tickets shy of capacity. In a dark match, the Dupes beat Rodney and Joey Abs. Davie Florida Mayor Harry Venus, who has wrestled a few times on indie shows and is being trained for a future WWF angle by Rocky Johnson, came out, announced for some reason, as the mayor of South Florida.
Rodney and Ab stomped on him until the Dupes made the save.
Vic pinned Gas in a terrible match. For Heat, who Cool beat Hardys.
Stratus dragged Lita to the back while choking her with her jacket, allowing GMS to pin Jeff.
Cool and Hardys both saved Lita. Buchanan pinned Crash to reverse his core loss. Saturn beat Godfather via DQ.
Steven tried to put Sax on the hose, but both Saturn and Godfather jumped out of the ring.
Godfather tried to hit Steven with a stick. He moved, and instead he hit Saturn for the DQ. Snow beat Rios with a new submission move. Bradshaw beat Midian and Gangrel in a handicap match. For SmackDown, Angle pinned Jericho.
Angle apologized to Undertaker before he matched.
Jericho, since he can't call Stephanie a slut or hoe on SmackDown, now calls her a tramp. Stephanie was at ringside and interfered, hitting Jericho with a low blow with a scepter to set up Angle's win. Angle was throwing food around in celebration, and got some of the food on Taker's bike. Midian told Angle it was Taker's bike, and Angle ran out of the building and grabbed a taxi. Benoit challenged Rock to a title match. Foley instead made it a 6-man for the main event with Edge and Christian and Benoit versus Chyna and Rock and Guerrero. Dudley's beat Warrington and Brown. Dudley's were about to use a table, but Steven grabbed the table and took it backstage. Steven said he was going to stop gratuitous violence. Foley said Triple H could have a singles match with Jericho only if he could win a handicap match on SmackDown.
Ivory and Jacqueline beat Malenko. Apparently they were practicing early, so it wasn't that bad. Malenko came out with 2 of the women that were Godfather's hoes on Heat.
Crash interfered, allowing the women to win. Venus beat Rikishi to win the IC title when Taz hit Rikishi with a WWF TV camera, and then the money shot.
Tanda interfered earlier, but Too Cool made the save. Rikishi's belt came off and it was awkward as he tried to hold it on while still wrestling.
Blackman pinned Bossman when Snow, disguised as a vendor, hit Bossman with a tray.
Undertaker and Kane beat Tanda when Kane pinned Albert after a choke slam.
Kane was about to choke slam Stratus, but Venus pulled her to safety. Kaientai and Brooklyn Brawler beat Triple H in a 3-on-1. Triple H pinned Funaki and Taka and had Brawler laid out, but shoved Earl Hebner.
Jericho ran out and laid out Triple H with a lionsault right in front of the ref, who counted to 3 as Brawler pinned Triple H. Triple H then beat up Funaki, Taka and Brawler after. Brawler even juiced. While he was doing this, Jericho left in Triple H's limo. Maine saw Guerrero and Chyna and Rock over Edge and Christian and Benoit. Benoit and Rock never locked up and Chyna was kept out until the very end. Chyna pinned Christian with a power bomb. Shane came out and attacked Rock. Rock chased Shane to the back and Benoit put Chyna in the crossface again. After the show went off the air, Rock gave Benoit a people's elbow. With Raw moving to TNN, which airs in Canada, USA doesn't, that leads to a conflict with TSN, the Canadian sports channel that has 3 years left on its contract to broadcast Raw. Raw is one of the highest, and at times the highest rated show on the station. Ultimately, most feel TSN will be doomed in the long run because of the TNN feed. Even though at one point TSN had agreed not to preempt the show, it often doesn't air live if baseball or hockey games are scheduled for prime time on Mondays. There has also been far more pressure in Canada as it pertains to content, so TSN heavily edits the content of the show, which shouldn't be as big an issue now as in the past, but is still an issue. Canadian wrestling fans hated the editing, and when the content was at its most raunchy, editing was the heaviest, and there was a period where Tuesday morning was complaint morning from wrestling fans at TSN. It is not certain whether TNN will be forced to run the same feed as TSN, as has been the case with many network shows that air on 2 different channels, one outside Canada that comes in on cable and the other a Canadian show, that have to show the Canadian feed when it comes into Canada. The feeling is that eventually the Canadian audience will start as habit watching the TNN feed, which will never be preempted or edited. There is some question as to whether TNN would be forced to pick up the Canadian feed, as there are programs in Canada simulcasted on both American and Canadian channels where the American channel in Canada is forced to pick up the Canadian feed. There has also been talk at TSN of going with Nitro on Mondays, conceding the inevitability that the WWF viewers will switch to TNN. Headline Sports in Canada is once again looking into picking up SmackDown, which doesn't air in Canada, as well as the XFL. There is a lot of talk that Sunday Night Heat will be given a new format for NTV, with more music and less first-run wrestling. Eric Mink of the New York Daily News, a TV writer, wrote a column laughing about Stephen Chow.
USA Cable President's statement that the loss of the WWF will have a negligible effect on our ratings and a positive effect on our profits.
Of course, the line about ratings is clearly transparent, as how is USA going to find anything to draw numbers consistently even one half? They'd be very lucky to get 1/3 of what they do for their 2 hours of wrestling on Monday night, not to mention whatever slight effect it'll have when it comes to promotion of other shows on the network to the large Raw audience. The loss of heat hurts the entire Sunday night lineup. Is the loss of those other ratings and ability to charge ad rates, plus whatever costs the company will have to replace the 5 hours per week of programming as well as the ad money the shows generate enough to offset the $26 million plus winning the lawsuit would have cost USA in WWF rights plus whatever ad revenue the new shows will generate? Well, the fact they went to the expense of going to court to keep it seems to answer that question. Bob Holly had surgery this past week for the broken arm he suffered when Angle moonsaulted him and his knee landed on Holly's forearm. Holly needed both plates and screws inserted in the arm and is expected out of action for 3 months. Maybe he can come back with a bionic forearm like Lex Luger used to have. Tori suffered a shoulder separation the night before King of the Ring in Madison Square Garden. She may need surgery as well. It was not the same injury, although it was the same shoulder, that she had injured first in Japan. Her injury nixes the planned program of X-Pac and Tori vs. Guerrero in China, which would have been the first in-ring major program China would have ever worked against another woman. The whole gimmick of China is that she was a woman who worked like she was a male wrestler. Dean Malenko has been working through his shoulder injury. Big Show will probably return to television imminently, but not go back on the road for a few more weeks. Perry Saturn's back is giving him a lot of problems. He's also working through it but may at some point have to take time off. On eBay this week, somebody is auctioning off photos he had taken of Owen Hart's death. On one of the NBC commercials for the Summer Olympics, they show Angle celebrating his 1996 gold medal win. Vince took himself off the air as a way to freshen up and give more people airtime. The feeling is when he's not a TV character, he can work backstage during the shows and focus on the shows as a whole better than when he's a character and his main focus then becomes getting his own lines right. Much of the media for once has seen through the idea of Monday Night Football hiring Dennis Miller as an announcer and replacing Leslie Visser with Melissa Stark, who is 20 years younger, as a sideline reporter, as meant as a counter to the success of Raw among young males. WWF has had talks with Eric Angle, the older brother of Kurt, but he hasn't been signed to a developmental deal. WWF is also talking with at least 3 wrestlers who failed to make the team in the recent Olympic trials, but none have signed at press time. In the meeting with Scott Levy, Raven, it was made clear that he was coming in with a relatively low guarantee, by the standards of what a wrestler of his stature would be expected to get, and has to prove he's past his problems and that he's coming in with a zero-tolerance policy if he screws up. If he doesn't screw up, he'll be given every chance to be the top-line performer he can be. A lot of the wrestlers who had worked with him in the past went to bat for him because they wanted him in the mix. The Aggression CD was number 168 on the charts this past week, selling 8,016 units. Ross and Lawler auditioned for an XFL announcing job for this coming season. In the absolutely useless trivia department, Rock's WWF title win on June 25th at King of the Ring in Boston was number 5 for his career, tying Hulk Hogan and Bret Hart on the all-time list. It should also be noted when Triple H wins his next title soon enough, that he'll also reach number 5. And he won his first title late August of 1999, so he'll probably do it all within 1 year, which probably explains why this is all useless. SmackDown tapings on June 27th in Hartford, Connecticut drew a sellout 11,007, paying $300,241. July 1st in Houston drew a sellout 15,871, paying $475,365. I think that's 9 straight sellouts for Houston. And July 2nd in Tampa drew 11,029, paying $316,026. Because of it being a holiday weekend, no merchandise figures for this week are available. In Houston, Bossman and Buchanan were still teaming up and actually won since they faced the soon-to-be broken-up Headbangers, although they teased dissension throughout. They pushed the upcoming Jericho vs. Triple H feud on the show. First, Triple H interfered in the Jericho vs. Angle match, causing Angle to lose via DQ. Jericho was laid out by both a pedigree and Olympic slam. Godfather said that he was no longer allowed to do the fatty line on TV but could do it at house shows. After Acolytes beat Snow and Blackman, Crash came out and hit Blackman with a garbage can lid to try and win the hardcore title, but Snow saved Blackman and Crash ran off. Main event saw Rock over Triple H. At one point Triple H hit Rock with the title belt, but ref Earl Hebner was bumped. When Tim White ran out, Rock kicked out, and Triple H decked him.
Triple H hit the pedigree but no ref. What a moron for punching two refs at this point. And Jericho came in and gave him a lion salt, but when Hebner recovered, Triple H kicked out. After all this, Rock used a people's elbow for the pin.
They pushed hard the Fans Access Convention on March 30th and WrestleMania at the Astrodome on April 1st. In Tampa, they had Mideon hit the ring dressed up like The Undertaker, and Gerald Briscoe, coming out to Real American, hit the ring and put him in the figure 4.
Briscoe, since he lives in Tampa and gets to push his body shop on the local house shows, got to play face for the night. They also had Crash Holly regain the hardcore title from Blackman, and seconds later had Blackman win it back.
At the show they announced Survivor Series coming to Tampa on November 19th.
The Reader's Pages. Funk Condito. The Terry Funk-Chris Condito match next to a live horse in a stable was the single most disgusting thing I've seen since the Owen Hart disaster. I'm sure Vince Russo is familiar with what happened to Christopher Reeve, so for him to put two of his wrestlers in that same position is about as unethical as a company cutting an employee's pay in half if they are injured on the job. While Funk, who I have the utmost respect for, may have a wish to end his career as an active wrestler, that still doesn't excuse the blatant disregard for human life that was displayed by Russo. The 2000 answer to Bill Watts. First arises the question of racism.
Is Vince Russo a racist?
Beyond a shadow of a doubt. I should have the right to not hire a fag if I don't want to, said Bill Watts in 1991.
I'm an American. I don't care about Japanese or Mexican wrestlers, said Vince Russo in 1999.
There's no difference in these two statements. I've heard all kinds of defenses for Russo's comments, the most popular being, well, he didn't mean it like that, or he didn't think it was a racist statement or didn't mean to be racist.
Those hold no water.
Ignorance of racism is the very definition of racism.
There is not one shred of evidence that anyone turned off their TV sets just because a Japanese or a Mexican wrestler was on.
Good wrestling and good entertainment make good television.
Race and ethnicity have nothing to do with it.
There is no defense for Russo's John Rocker-like comments. His attitudes have no place in this era, especially when put in a management position of deciding who is hired, fired and who gets pushed. Wrestlers put their bodies at risk enough without having to risk being kicked in the head by a horse. While the majority of the blame has been and should be placed at the feet of Vince McMahon for the Owen Hart tragedy, I have to ask, whose idea was it for Hart to do a stupid gimmick like the return of the Blue Blazer and come from the ceiling?
Russo has had more than 1 year to learn from the death of Hart, but he hasn't.
For 13 years, I've put up with so much crap, like we all have, but have never once been ashamed to call myself a wrestling fan until now.
I'm a fan of the wrestlers. I pay my hard-earned money to see them do things only they can do, not to see them throw away their dignity and ability with a sad excuse for a television show.
All the shills that scream about how great this is should be ashamed. Why don't they address that any company that loses $61 million in 1 year in this business cannot in any way, shape or form be considered a success? Tim Davis. Questions. Please, my tortured mind is whirling and only you can save me. Please answer my questions. Is pro wrestling really a good match for the Nashville network? I mean, when you think about all that drinking and shooting and car crashing, and incest and broken marriages, the WWF could end up being a really bad influence on country music. Do you think Saddam Hussein's troops in the last war appreciated that they were getting the rub from the U.S. Army? Looking back, don't you agree that Sid Vicious' consecutive win streak was underrated? Personally, I thought it was the greatest sports accomplishment since Joe DiMaggio hit in 2,814 straight games. WWF offered the public stock by saying, "Get a piece of the rock." Considering what a fine investment it has turned out to be, shouldn't they have name-dropped Crash Holly instead? By the way, did Eddie Guerrero's wallet ever turn up? Why were protesters upset over Lodi and Lenny's fellatio act, when, in fact, they sucked far less than most WCW wrestlers? Why do people constantly complain that Vince Russo buries all non-English speaking wrestlers? Scott Steiner gets a push every week. Why do people say wrestling is bad for children? It teaches us science. Silicon is one of the 109 elements. Math. Mark Henry showing Mae Young how many times 450 goes into 77. History. Every pay-per-view is the greatest pay-per-view in history. And religion. Do unto others, preferably with a kendo stick. Since Samuel L. Jackson is over 50 years old, shouldn't he be in WCW vying for the Rookie of the Year award? When you started The Observer, did you ever think the business would progress to a point where you would type the words, "Disco attacked Iokea with a loaded fish or salad tongs to the groin"? Why do people write the term Triple H? Wouldn't that make him HHHHHHHHH? Is it true the next inductees to the WCW arm of Misfits in Action will be General Confusion, Major Screw-Up, Corporal Punishment, and Private Vendettas? Why is Stephanie McMahon still WWF Women's Champion? We all saw The Rock give her the rock bottom and get a clean pin on her at the end of WrestleMania. Why should Rock get big money to star in Mummy 2 when the true originator didn't make a dime? If I were Ron Race, I'd be mad. Is it true that Taz walked past a Toys R Us register and it rang up a sale for a Hulk Hogan action figure? A while back, Jim Hellwig offered to do a shoot match in ECW with the proviso that if he lasted 30 seconds, he'd own the company. Was Heyman afraid to agree to his terms because he thought Warrior might spend the entire 30 seconds speaking one sentence and leaving everyone in the arena unconscious? If you turn up the sound on Nitro really high and see Reed Fleer watching his father, Hulk Hogan, Kevin Nash and Terry Funk all running around, can you hear the kid whisper, "I see dead people"? Everyone wonders who the toughest man in wrestling really is. Meng, Ken Shamrock or Tank Abbott? Isn't it obvious the answer is Jim Ross? 1 week after Helmsley broke his arm, it was already 100% healed and forgotten. Will the XFL be suing the NFL to regain control of some of the franchise names that pro football owners stole from wrestlers? I'm thinking of the Patriots, Del Wilkes, the Giants, Paul White, the Oilers, Lex Luger, the Redskins, Brother Love, the Browns, Pat Patterson's underpants, and the 49ers, everyone who gets a push in WCW. Those Linda McMahon segments are dynamite. Is she getting speech lessons from Stephen Hawking? Does Steve Borden have any trouble getting a car loan or a mortgage after those 25 evil stings, fake stings and stuntman stings ruined his credit rating? And wasn't the Vampiro Sting Set Your Opponent on Fire match nothing but a blatant attempt to recreate the kind of fan excitement the WWF had when The Undertaker set fire to Vince McMahon's teddy bear? Is it true that WCW, always on the lookout for fresh faces, is looking into stealing away the promising WWF newcomer whose contract ran out? Fabulous Moolah. Tank Abbott comes out to Goldberg's music. Sean Stasiak does Kurt Hennig's act. Kenyon copies DDP's routine. Big Show imitates Hulk Hogan. Prince Iok acts like Prince. Terry Funk disguises himself as Ralphus. Everybody does the Rikishi dance. And every big match ends with a rip-off of the Bret Hart HBK Survivor Series finish. I guess what I'm wondering is, how do we know you're the real Dave Meltzer? Desmond Devlin. Battle Creek, Michigan. Cornette. Jim Cornette's comments on IATA last week were a real eye-opener for me in so many respects. That he would question the honor of Vince Russo in WCW comes as no surprise. Nor should it. The way they do business is criminal. But what's equally criminal is the way Cornette tried to portray Vince McMahon as the WWF as the bastions of integrity in pro wrestling. As if there ever could be. It's sobering that he seems to have bought the revisionist version of wrestling history and the warped sense of truth peddled by McMahon. You'd think that someone who was on the front lines when McMahon ran roughshod over the territories in the 80s would know better. In previous interviews he's made comments to the effect that he has no respect for Russo and Kevin Nash because they didn't remain loyal to McMahon after he had made them stars. When I questioned him about this on the show, pointing out that's exactly how McMahon built his empire in the 80s by taking wrestlers from other companies, he replied that he didn't know of any time that McMahon took someone away from a territory without letting the promoter know first. Really? I think Vern Gagne, Don Owen, Jerry Jarrett, Jim Crockett and a host of other promoters could enlighten him. I'm not sure how Cornette could have kept a straight face while making such a statement that is straight out of the McMahon corporate speak vocabulary. He then clarified his position on Russo, stating that what he really didn't like was how he left the WWF, feeling he should have been a man about it and told McMahon to his face that he was leaving. As if McMahon is due any such courtesy. You reap what you sow. As I recall, McMahon wasn't so much of a man himself when he double-crossed Bret Hart in Montreal after agreeing to a disqualification finish. Cornette went on to slander the WCW front office and Russo, question their integrity and honesty, while portraying McMahon and the WWF as being ethical. Please. I don't disagree that the WCW front office and management are a bunch of clowns. I don't disagree with his assertion that Russo is a liar. But Russo learned wrestling in that respects from the best, McMahon. When I challenged him on McMahon's integrity, bring up the Owen Hart death, he labeled my comments, "The WWF pried Owen's dead body off the canvas without hesitation and continued on with the pay-per-view," as being distasteful. The only thing distasteful was the WWF's handling of that situation. Fact. Owen Hart plummeted 75 feet to his death on a WWF pay-per-view show. Fact. The WWF sent EMTs down to ringside and carted his body to the back. Fact. The WWF continued on with the show. Fact.
They didn't inform the live audience of his death so as not to spoil the desired crowd responses they wanted for the rest of the show. Fact. McMahon himself told Michael Landsberg that the thought of not continuing on with the show never even entered his mind, and then proceeded to speak for Owen, claiming that Owen would have wanted the show to continue. Doesn't it bother Cornette that the thought of stopping the show didn't even cross McMahon's mind? That's truly distasteful. The WWF was cold, calculated and heartless in the handling of that tragedy. These guys are humanitarians? They're somehow more ethical than WCW?
He also seems determined to blame the ruining of wrestling on Russo and WCW.
Like the WWF has done a lot to preserve the integrity of wrestling?
Like the Patterson vs. Briscoe evening gown match isn't as stupid or as moronic as the push of Major Guns or Sting being set on fire and thrown off the scaffolding. As a reporter who has written several critical articles on WCW and Russo, I've solicited comments from you, the Law's Jeff Marek and a host of others. I've never bothered to try and get a comment from Cornette. The same reason I've never tried to get a comment from Bruno Sammartino when writing something critical of McMahon. He lacks credibility.
Much like Sammartino, Cornette comes off as a bitter, out-of-touch person who is clearly biased and is lashing out.
His self-righteous, sanctimonious preaching is pathetic.
How he can even make arguments about integrity and ethics in connection to the WWF and McMahon while maintaining a straight face is a miracle.
He maintains that in his dealings with McMahon over the past 7 years, he's never lied to him, and that's why he can attest to his character. Cornette's short-sightedness is appalling. That he can overlook the countless transgressions McMahon has committed and deem him a good person is ridiculous. In the few times I've dealt with McMahon, he's been both cordial and pleasant. That doesn't mean I turn a blind eye to the fact that he, like every other wrestling promoter, is a con man who is only interested in himself.
Wrestling is not an unsoiled business.
It's a dirty one. No amount of whitewashing will ever sanitize it. That goes for all the promotions. Not just WCW.
No matter how much polish Cornette puts on McMahon and the WWF's image, the strong stench of corruption emanating from Stamford will never subsist. That Cornette would even foster the pretense that the WWF and McMahon have even an ounce of integrity is downright laughable.
Is Cornette the greatest wrestling manager in history? No question about it.
Does he have a vast knowledge and sense of wrestling history?
Better than most.
Is he right when he says Russo has no respect for wrestling?
Absolutely.
But does he honestly think McMahon does? Does he think McMahon cares about his wrestlers any more than WCW?
Go ask Bret Hart how much McMahon appreciates loyalty.
Does he think McMahon, who has given us such gems as the gobbledygooker, who has pushed himself and his family on television to the point of nausea, and who's done irreparable damage to the sport, is more respectful than Russo?
Cornette wants to lay the blame at Russo for changing pro wrestling into a freak show.
And Russo is in part to blame. But what does that say about his friend and colleague McMahon, the man who gave Russo his power in the first place?
McMahon is just as much to blame.
So where is Cornette's sanctimonious venom directed at McMahon? I think it's quite ironic that when someone else asked if he would ever take over the booking in WCW, he said no, because it was his intent never to leave the city limits of Louisville ever again.
Cornette is comfortable in his own hometown. Just like he's comfortable in his own fantasy world of wrestling reality he's constructed for himself. I hope he does stay in Louisville and his world forever. God forbid he should ever venture out and see the real world. God forbid he should see McMahon and the WWF or who and what they really are.
John Molinaro,
Toronto, Ontario. Steroids.
Just want to toss my 2 cents in on something I read in The Observer. In my 6 years of covering the NFL, I have never seen rampant steroid abuse or even minimal steroid abuse.
In my opinion, the current testing process is effective. Alex Merves. WWF New York. The Nitro Grill has been closed for lunch for some time. It does some business and the rent can't be that high. It's not the only theme restaurant in trouble. Most of these have had a shakeout after the market has gotten saturated. Bankruptcies have included Planet Hollywood. The Rainforest Cafe is in trouble. What percentage of people would go to a wrestling restaurant instead of the Hard Rock Cafe? In Las Vegas, right across the street is a Harley-Davidson cafe. That said, a couple of months ago, I had a fun time there watching Nitro. The food was good. Nitro was on a bunch of big screens and they had some Nitro girl wannabes walking around giving out tickets for prizes. The WWF New York restaurant/bar is another story. This one is a disaster. I was there last week for Raw. The place is huge. Most of the tables were full but the place wasn't crowded on its busiest night of the week. The cost of this place is tremendous with tons of TVs to watch Raw. They have a big WWF store in front. The biggest problem is the cost of running has to be the location.
At 43rd and Broadway, the place has to do big business every night.
It doesn't, and it won't. The WWFE stock is starting to make a nice move. This is mostly due to the new TV deal, which is a tremendous boost to the WWF.
Also, with NBC as a partner, the XFL won't be a big loss to the WWF when it goes bust, except in the ego department.
Dave Katz. Phil Mushnick. Once again, Phil Mushnick has insulted the reader's intelligence. Mushnick was absolutely drooling at the fact that MCIWorld.com had pulled its advertising from SmackDown. He congratulated MCIWorld.com for coming to the realization that pro wrestling has become pornography for children. Yes, just a few pages away from Mushnick's column were 3 print ads for strip clubs. These ads were no less pornographic in nature than anything on WWF television, as they talked about topless, nude, 30 superstars, and private slow dancing. Logically, Mushnick should be lobbying for advertisers to pull their ads from the post as well. Nobody should hold their breath on that happening. The bottom line is it's up to me, as a parent, to determine what is or isn't appropriate for my teenage children to see.
It's time for Mushnick, whose blatantly selective view of political correctness has run thin, to step down from his bully pulpit where he epitomizes hypocrisy.
Jeff Bookons.
Livingston, New Jersey.
Russo. What goes around comes around.
Does Vince Russo get it? I was an avid reader of Vince Russo's column in the WWF and Raw magazines. Not really great, but a good read for someone who didn't have the internet at the time.
He always shot straight.
Most of the time his message was simple.
To hell with wrestling. People cheer for a sock. Yes, a sock. A goddamn sweat sock.
Don't you smarts get it?
While many people agreed with him at the time, I think Russo's biggest problem is he himself agreed with it too much. It's caused him to burn out.
Was it really the over-the-topness corny drama that got people hooked, or was it the characters and the wrestlers? If it was the over-the-topness, the ratings would have fallen by now, considering how considerably tame the show has become.
How do you think Russo feels today when 2 hours of his storytelling gets pounded by mediocre to average angles and top-notch matches? This goes against everything he has taught himself. Russo is a firm believer he's the one with his hand on the pulse of America. People don't care about competition. They want fluff. The Jericho vs. Helmsley quarter hour did a 7.7. To a degree, Russo is right. Angle-wise, anyway. But everything in moderation. I don't think Russo understands this. Virtually every match on WCW is plastered with cluster finishes, boring interruptions, and the feeling that the match isn't very important. If people didn't care about wrestling, they wouldn't be watching in the first place. You can't forget what your product base is, and that's what he's doing.
Who does he expect to attract? Movie buffs?
Drama buffs.
They can rent a good movie or watch HBO.
If they have to rely on Russo's storytelling, lots of luck.
What happened to pro wrestling with great heat and angles? Now it's a show with bad wrestling and poor acting.
Throw shit to the wall and see what sticks and forget what got the company to the dance. The ratings after what Russo thought was a successful pay-per-view were horrible. So now he's taking time off to think about it.
What will he think of next?
Get rid of the ring? Stage a death on the air?
Get himself a pair of breast implants?
Shock TV only can go so far.
Russo and McMahon pushed the envelope in the WWF.
Many loved it, including myself.
Just remembered, the same sock Russo thought was what people truly wanted to see, maybe lying in the envelope when you tear it open.
Now it's worn, tired, stretched and soiled. Nobody may want near that sock.
And then, and only then, will Russo have to realize he was the one, all along, who didn't get it in the end.
Ryan DiBiase. Whether it's the clash of titans in the ring or the drama that unfolds outside it, we're here to break it down, match by match, feud by feud. Remember, in the world of wrestling, every day is a battle, and every victory is a story waiting to be told.
Until next time, keep the passion alive, and never stop wrestling with the possibilities.
This is the Pro Wrestle Machine,